confident in its naval might, focused on controlling the seas. Austria-Hungary, fragile and reliant on Germany, merely hoped its empire wouldn't splinter before it achieved any semblance of victory. But war wasn't solely about countries and their territorial ambitions. It was also profoundly about people and their fervent emotions. In bustling cafes and across newspaper headlines, citizens passionately discussed patriotism, honor, and the ultimate sacrifice for their national flag. Young men, their hearts swelling with idealism, genuinely believed that war would transform them into heroes, that they would return home laden with medals and thrilling tales. Few, if any, could conceive of dying in the wretched. The Balkans had long been ominously dubbed the powder keg of Europe, and for very good reason. The once mighty Ottoman Empire, formerly a dominant force in the region, was now a shadow of its former self, weak and vulnerable. New nations like Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania clawed at each other, eager to expand their own territories. A clandestine group of young Bosnian Serbs, seething with resentment over Austrian rule, had meticulously crafted a plan. They intended to deliver a message, a deadly one. Among them was a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip, a figure destined to become a name etched in infamy. As the Archduke's motorcade, by a cruel twist of fate, veered down the wrong street, Princip stood there, a pistol clutched in his hand. 2 shots. That was all it took. Franz Ferdinand lay dead. His wife, Sophie, also dead. The sprawling empire was plunged into a stunned silence. At first, it seemed a localized tragedy, a royal assassination in a perpetually troubled corner of the empire. But within mere weeks, that single, isolated moment would inexorably drag all of Europe into the abyss of war. Austria-Hungary, consumed by fury, laid the blame squarely on Serbia. Serbia, in turn, vehemently denied culpability. Russia, bound by Slavic solidarity, unequivocally stood behind Serbia. Germany, in lockstep, supported Austria-Hungary. France, loyal to its alliance, backed Russia. Britain initially waited, holding its breath. Letters, terse and fraught, were exchanged. Ultimatums, impossible to accept, were delivered. Whispers of dark secrets were shared. And in the lengthening shadows, meticulously crafted war plans began to unfurl. The fuse had been lit. The powder keg of Europe was poised to explode. And Europe, once proud, wealthy, and brimming with boundless promise, was about to plunge headlong into the bloodiest conflict it had ever known. The world held its breath, but not for long. The assassination in Sarajevo was not merely a distant Balkan crisis, it had, with terrifying speed, metastasized into a sprawling European catastrophe. The July crisis, a period of frantic, often desperate diplomacy, had cracked open the ancient fault lines between old empires, and now, those fissures were splitting wide open. The clock was ticking, a relentless countdown to an unimaginable reckoning. Chapter 2. The Spark, Assassination of Archduke Frederick Thorn. It was a brilliant Sunday morning, June 28, 1914, a date that would forever be seared into the annals of history. The cobblestone streets of Silverwood, capital of the troubled province of Briarwood, buzzed with an almost feverish excitement. Crowds thronged the thoroughfares, eager to catch a glimpse of the royal procession. Banners fluttered in the gentle breeze, martial music filled the air, and soldiers stood rigidly in their gleaming, polished uniforms. In an open-top motorcar rode Archduke Frederick Thorn, the esteemed heir to the mighty Austro-Valerian Empire, and his beloved wife, Sophia. It was their wedding anniversary, a day meant for joy and quiet celebration. They had journeyed to Silverwood on a goodwill visit, a carefully staged demonstration of the Empire's enduring strength, and a subtle attempt to quell the simmering tensions in the restive region. But beneath the surface, something far more sinister was churning. Briarwood had been formally annexed by the Austro-Valerian Empire in 1908, a move that had deeply inflamed many Serbs and Bosnian Slavs. Their fervent desire was to break free, to unite with their kinsmen in the burgeoning nation of Serbia, and to forge their own sovereign Slavic state. To these ardent nationalists, the Austro-Valerian Empire was not a legitimate ruler but a tyrannical oppressor. And now, the Archduke, a living embodiment of that very empire, was parading through their streets. Hidden amongst the jubilant crowd were 7 young men, shadowy members of a clandestine nationalist group known only as the Black Hand. They clung to the grim conviction that violence was the sole path to achieving true independence. For weeks, they had meticulously trained, smuggled weapons across the porous border, and waited with a chilling patience for this very day. Each carried a concealed pistol, a small, deadly bomb, and a vial of potent poison. They were prepared to kill, or to die, for their cause. As the Archduke's motorcade slowly navigated Silverwood's winding, narrow streets, the first assassin caught sight of the car and, at the critical moment, froze, too paralyzed by fear to act. The next, with a surge of adrenaline, hurled his bomb, but it struck the car's folded roof, harmlessly deflecting and detonating beneath another vehicle, injuring startled bystanders and a few officers. Chaos erupted. The Archduke's car was immediately whisked away, and the assassins scattered, vanishing into the panicked throngs. One desperate youth attempted to swallow his poison and leap into the nearby river, but both attempts failed spectacularly. He was seized and brutally beaten by an enraged mob before police officers finally managed to drag him away. Everyone, it seemed, believed the terrifying ordeal was over, a failed attempt, a lucky escape. But the day was far from done. Archduke Thorn, displaying a remarkable, almost stubborn resolve, insisted on continuing his visit. He wished to proceed to the hospital to visit those injured by the earlier blast. His wife, Sophia, with unwavering devotion, insisted on remaining steadfastly by his side. They re-entered their car, with the same driver, embarking on the same ill-fated route, utterly oblivious that a single, innocent mistake was about to irrevocably alter the course of history. The driver, in a moment of confusion, took a wrong turn. As the car attempted to reverse and correct its path, it came to a complete stop directly in front of a small, unassuming cafe. And standing there, by a cruel twist of pure chance, was Gavrilo Princip. He was just 19 years old, pale, thin, and often sickly. He had awoken that morning with the singular, grim purpose of killing the Archduke. After the initial, failed attempt, he had believed his opportunity was lost and had stopped for a sandwich. And now, by a cruel hand of fate or a stroke of terrifying accident, his target was precisely, unbelievably, in front of him. He stepped forward, pulled out his pistol, and fired 2 swift, echoing shots. The first struck Sophia in the stomach. The second found its mark in Frederick Thorn's neck. She died almost instantly. He collapsed, blood gushing from his mouth, his final breath a whispered utterance of her name. Moments later, the car sped away, but it was tragically too late. The future emperor of Austro-Valeria was dead. His wife, a woman many had considered socially unfit for royalty, had died faithfully by his side. The devastating news spread like wildfire across Silverwood, then across the empire, and finally, across the entire continent. At first, many struggled to comprehend the immense weight of it all. Political assassinations were, sadly, not uncommon in those tumultuous days. In the preceding decades, leaders and royals had been murdered in Italy, Russia, France, and even the United States. Often, these events provoked outrage, but rarely did they ignite a full-blown war. But this time, things were disturbingly different. The Austro-Valerian government was absolutely incandescent with rage. Their beloved heir had been brutally murdered by a Slavic nationalist, and what was worse, the assassin was inextricably linked to a shadowy network that led directly back to Serbia. Serbia was a small nation, yes, but one swelling with burgeoning pride and dangerous ambition, and it boasted powerful, unwavering supporters in Russia. Austria-Valeria had long harbored anxieties about Serbia's growing influence in the Balkans. This assassination felt like the ultimate, unbearable provocation. Behind the closed, velvet-draped doors in Vienna, leaders convened. Stern military generals, calculating politicians, and the elderly Emperor Francis Joseph himself debated the unthinkable. Some urged caution and calm. But others, particularly the hawkish figures within the military, clamored for immediate retribution. They believed Serbia needed to be severely chastised. A brutal message sent to any who dared defy imperial authority. They also had a compelling reason to act with swiftness. They had the unconditional backing of Germany. In early July, just days after the assassination, Austro-Valerian diplomats traveled to Berlin. They met with Kaiser Wilhelm II, the German emperor. Though shocked by the assassination, he offered his unequivocal support, what has since become famously known as the blank check. It was a solemn promise that Germany would stand by Austria-Valeria, no matter the consequences. No matter what action they chose to take. With Germany's formidable reassurance, Austria-Valeria grew bold, but also meticulous. They spent weeks preparing, conducting internal investigations, and meticulously drafting a carefully worded ultimatum to Serbia. It was a list of demands, designed to be almost impossible to accept. It insisted that Serbia permit Austro-Valerian officials to conduct an investigation inside Serbia, a blatant, unforgivable violation of its national sovereignty. The demands were, in essence, Serbia was gripped by panic. Its leaders frantically scrambled to buy precious time. Surprisingly, they accepted most of the demands, even those that painfully wounded their national pride. However, they rejected the single, crucial point about allowing foreign investigators onto Serbian soil. It was, they argued, too humiliating, too dangerous a surrender of their independence. On July 25, Austria-Valeria, unmoved, severed all diplomatic ties. War was now all but inevitable. 2 days later, on July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the fatal shots echoed in Silverwood, Austria-Valeria formally declared war on Serbia. The fuse had finally reached the powder. Within hours, Serbia appealed to its staunch protector, Russia. Tsar Nicholas II, knowing he would not, back down, understood that Russia had to support its Slavic brethren. Mobilization began. Trains rumbled carrying troops, orders were signed, frantic messages were dispatched. Germany, observing this escalating chain of events, reacted with chilling speed. It issued a stark warning to Russia: cease mobilization or face war. Russia did not stop. And so, on August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. France was next, bound by its alliance with Russia, grimly preparing for the inevitable conflict. It too began moving its forces. Germany now faced its worst nightmare: war on 2 fronts. Speed was no longer just important, it was absolutely vital. They had to strike first. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. But to reach France quickly, German troops had to pass through Belgium, a small, officially neutral country. Belgium, clinging to its sovereignty, flatly refused. And so, on August 4th, Germany invaded Belgium. That very same day, Britain, bound by a long-standing treaty to defend Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany. The dominoes had fallen, each one toppling the next with terrifying precision. In just over a month, a seemingly isolated spark in a distant city had engulfed all of Europe in a raging inferno. It had all begun with 2 bullets on a quiet summer morning. Frederick Thorn's death, alone, did not cause the war. But it provided the perfect, undeniable pretext for rival powers, primed for conflict, to finally act. The intricate alliances, the deep-seated fears, the fervent nationalism, the gleaming weapons, they were all waiting. The assassination was merely the trigger. In Vienna, people mourned their Archduke, but also, with a chilling resignation, braced for war. In Berlin, men cheered wildly in the streets, convinced that victory would be swift and glorious. In Paris, trains filled with eager soldiers, waving flags and clutching flowers, departed for the front. In London, newspapers printed ominous maps, and politicians delivered stirring, fateful speeches. No one, not truly, fully understood the magnitude of what was coming. They believed the war would be over by Christmas. They had no idea it would drag on for over 4 grueling years, claim millions of lives, and forever, irrevocably, change the world. The world was marching, blindly, towards something darker than it had ever known. The spark had become a flame, and soon, that flame would consume all of Europe. Chapter 3. The Tangled Web of Alliances. It began with a conflict between just 2 nations, the Austro-Valerian Empire and Serbia. But the conflict, like a virulent contagion, did not remain contained for long. Within a matter of days, the conflagration spread across the European continent. Cities that had once thrived on the exchange of goods and culture were now trading ominous threats and impossible ultimatums. And this escalation wasn't random, nor was it merely a stroke of bad luck. It was the chilling consequence of a carefully spun, almost invisible trap, woven from decades of promises and treaties, of loyalty and profound fear. For years preceding the conflict, Europe had meticulously bound itself together with a complex tapestry of secret agreements and formal alliances. Each great power did not stand alone, it stood intricately connected to others, forming a delicate but perilous balance. These alliances, ironically, were intended to preserve peace. The prevailing logic was that if every nation had formidable allies, no one would dare to launch an attack. But instead, they ensured that once one nation stumbled into war, others were inexorably pulled in, whether they desired it or not. To truly grasp why the war erupted with such terrifying speed and destructive force, we must journey back to the years preceding the assassination, back to a continent that, on the surface, appeared placid, but harbored immense tensions simmering just beneath the veneer. Following the decisive defeat of France in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71, a formidable new power had ascended in the very heart of Europe, Germany. Fast, industrialized, and remarkably efficient, it unified into a potent empire under the astute leadership of Otto von Bismarck and swiftly emerged as a formidable rival to older, established giants like Britain, France, and Russia. Bismarck, a master strategist, understood that this burgeoning power could easily accrue enemies. Thus, he meticulously constructed an intricate system of agreements designed to safeguard Germany's security and to keep France politically isolated. He masterminded the Triple Alliance in 1882, a formal military pact between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. The terms were clear: if one member was attacked by 2 or more countries, the others would immediately come to its aid. This pact was conceived to maintain peace through a formidable show of strength. But strength, as history often proves, invariably invites suspicion. On the opposing side, France, reeling from its past defeat, had no desire to stand alone. It looked eastward and discovered a crucial ally in Russia. Despite their stark differences, one a republic, the other an autocratic empire, they shared a common concern: the rapidly growing power of Germany. In 1894, they formalized their bond by signing the Franco-Russian alliance. And then came Britain. For most of the 19th century, Britain had steadfastly pursued a policy of splendid isolation, deliberately avoiding entanglement in continental European politics. But this long-held stance began to shift dramatically in the early 1900s. Germany's naval expansion was a growing concern, colonial tensions were mounting, and so Britain reluctantly began to seek out France. In 1904, Britain signed an understanding with France, known as the Entente Cordiale. Then, in 1907, it reached a similar agreement with Russia. These agreements were not as rigidly binding as the Triple Alliance, but collectively, France, Russia, and Britain formed what came to be known as the Triple Entente. Now, Europe was distinctly divided into 2 major, heavily armed camps. On one side stood Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other, France, Russia, and Britain. Each side had solemnly pledged to support the other in the event of an attack. But here lay the profound, tragic problem. These promises did not remain simple. They became increasingly tangled, riddled with secret clauses and overlapping commitments. And when the cataclysmic crisis of 1914 finally arrived, these very alliances did not prevent the war. Chillingly, they guaranteed it. Let us return to that pivotal moment after the assassination of Archduke Frederick Thorn. Austria-Hungary, consumed by a thirst for retribution, blamed Serbia and subsequently declared war. Serbia, in turn, desperately appealed to Russia for assistance, and Russia, with grim resolve, began mobilizing its colossal army. Germany, watching every move with intense scrutiny, now faced a critical decision. It had promised to support Austria-Hungary, but it also viewed Russia as an immense threat, a slow-moving, yet undeniably dangerous, adversary. So, Germany issued a stark, unequivocal warning to Russia: cease mobilization, or face the grim reality of war. Russia, unwavering, refused to back down. Germany now confronted its deepest fear. A war on two fronts, Russia to the east, France to the west. This nightmare scenario had long haunted German military leaders. They possessed a meticulously crafted plan for this very eventuality. The Schlieffen Plan. The strategy was to strike France first, delivering a swift, decisive knockout blow, and then pivot eastward to confront Russia. But to execute this lightning strike, Germany had to violate the neutrality of Belgium, a country protected by a treaty signed by all major powers, including Britain. Germany invaded Belgium anyway. And that single act irrevocably changed everything. Britain, initially, was not directly allied with France or Russia in a way that forced its intervention. But the brazen invasion of Belgium triggered a profound sense of moral duty and an unbreakable, decades-old promise. On August 4, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. In less than 2 weeks, a localized dispute had, through the intricate and deadly dance of alliances, spiraled into a devastating continental war. Let us trace this perilous chain of events once more. Following the invisible threads of the alliance web, Austria-Hungary attacks Serbia. Serbia calls on Russia. Russia mobilizes. Germany declares war on Russia. France, allied with Russia, is then targeted, so Germany declares war on France. Germany invades Belgium. Britain enters the fray to defend Belgium and support France. One link pulled the next, one promise triggered another. And the colossal war machine roared terrifyingly to life. But this intricate web did not merely confine itself to Europe. These alliances stretched across vast global empires. When Britain entered the war, so too did its sprawling colonies, from Canada to Australia to India. When France joined, soldiers from North Africa and Indochina were called upon to fight. The Russian Empire conscripted men from Central Asia and the Caucasus. Even distant Japan, allied with Britain since 1902, declared war on Germany in late August 1914 and began seizing German territories in the Pacific. Soon, even the ancient Ottoman Empire joined the fray, but not on the side many had anticipated. For months, the Ottomans hesitated, but Germany had meticulously courted them with enticing offers of money, modern weaponry, and military advisors. In October, the Ottomans officially entered the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Central Powers. The tangled web had ensnared yet another major empire. By the end of 1914, the world, in its entirety, was at war. And it was not simply a consequence of hatred or blind ambition. It was profoundly due to obligation. Promises made in times of perceived peace had, in a terrifying alchemy, transmuted into deadly commitments in a time of surging crisis. And here lies the most tragic irony: many of those alliances were inherently defensive. They were designed explicitly to prevent war. The logic was starkly simple. If everyone possessed strong, reliable friends, no one would dare to launch an attack. But the moment that single, fateful spark was lit, That very same logic precipitated a horrifying chain reaction. Because once mobilization began, once the wheels of the war machine started turning, backing down became an impossible, humiliating choice. To hesitate was to appear weak, to pause was to risk utter betrayal. Every single country believed it was acting solely in self-defense. Even as they simultaneously plunged the entire world into an unprecedented disaster. Germany claimed it was protecting Austria-Hungary. Russia asserted it was safeguarding Serbia. France insisted it was defending itself from German aggression. Britain declared it was protecting Belgium and maintaining the delicate European balance of power. Austria-Hungary maintained it was defending its sprawling empire from internal rebels. And so the narratives unfolded. No one, truly, believed they were igniting a world war. But each inexorable step rendered the next one entirely unavoidable. And once the armies began to move, by train, by horse, by foot, there was, horrifyingly, no turning back. Within mere weeks, the first trenches were hastily dug, the lines of battle starkly drawn, and the initial, brutal engagements commenced. The war that was optimistically prophesied to be over by Christmas was just beginning. And underlying all of it, like a meticulously spun spider's web ensnaring every struggling fly, was the insidious system of alliances. Some were publicly declared, some shrouded in secrecy, some explicitly clear, others disturbingly vague. But all of them carried an immense, fateful weight. It was a war born not merely of gunfire, but of promises. Promises some called honor, others sheer madness. And in the bitter end, millions of people perished for agreements they never personally signed, between countries they never even saw. The leaders who had so painstakingly built this intricate web could never have imagined it would, ultimately, tear down the very world they inhabited. But it did. And now, across the continent of Europe, nations stood locked in a desperate, existential combat, fighting not merely for territory, but for their very survival. The alliances had, chillingly, done their job. They had brought the world together, just not in peace, but in war. The assassination of Archduke Frederick Thorn wasn't just the end of a man's life. It was the chilling sound of a clock starting to tick. From that fateful moment in Silverwood, the world had precisely 1 month before everything would irrevocably change. 31 days. A relentless countdown towards an unimaginable catastrophe. And it didn't begin with shouts or the roar of gunfire. It began with telegrams, with hushed meetings behind closed doors. With meticulously chosen words that sounded calm but carried the undeniable weight of war. Chapter 4: The July Crisis. The Countdown to War. At first glance, it didn't seem as though a global disaster was looming. The world had witnessed assassinations before. Kings, queens, presidents, and various leaders had been struck down in the past. And war didn't always follow in their wake. But this time, it was fundamentally different. The death of Frederick Thorn didn't merely wound the Austro-Valerian Empire's pride, it gave them a potent, undeniable reason to finally act. For years, the Austro-Valerian Empire had regarded Serbia with growing unease. Serbia was a small nation, yes, but fiercely nationalistic. And many within the empire viewed it as a dangerous threat, a rebellious neighbor actively stirring up trouble among the Slavic people residing within Austria's borders. The assassination provided the empire with a perfect, if tragic, excuse to strike back, to deal with Serbia once and for all. But Austria-Valeria couldn't undertake such a monumental task alone. They desperately needed support, and so they turned to their most powerful and unwavering ally, Germany. Thus, just 5 days after the assassination, on July 5, 1914, Austria's leaders convened with the German Kaiser Wilhelm II. They presented their compelling case: Serbia had to be punished, and punished severely. And they sought to know, unequivocally, if Germany would stand by them. The Kaiser's response was affirmative. In fact, he offered what would become infamously known as the blank check, an ironclad promise of unconditional support. no matter what course of action Austria decided to take. With that formidable reassurance, Austria-Valeria commenced preparing its calculated response. However, they didn't act immediately. They waited, partly because their top generals were away on summer vacation, and partly because they wanted to proceed with extreme caution. They understood that any aggressive move against Serbia might provoke Russia, and they wished to avoid appearing as the initial aggressors. So, they spent the ensuing 2 weeks meticulously crafting what appeared, on the surface, to be a diplomatic overture, but was in reality a meticulously laid trap. On July 23, Austria-Valeria formally delivered a 10-point ultimatum to Serbia. It was a list of demands, and they were undeniably harsh. Serbia was instructed to suppress all anti-Austrian propaganda, remove officials Austria disliked, and permit Austrian agents to operate on Serbian soil to investigate the assassination. It was, in essence, a demand for profound humiliation. Austria knew, with absolute certainty, that Serbia would never agree to all of it. That was precisely the point. They sought to provoke a rejection, and then, with manufactured indignation, claimed they had no alternative but to declare war. But, surprisingly, Serbia did not entirely reject the ultimatum. In a remarkable display of political maneuvering, Serbia accepted most of the demands, even those that deeply wounded their national pride. They only requested clarification on one specific point: the allowance of Austrian police to operate within Serbia, which, they argued, would constitute a clear violation of their sovereignty. To almost everyone observing the unfolding drama, Serbia's reply seemed eminently reasonable. Even Britain, France, and Russia believed it was a sufficient basis to avert war. But Austria, driven by a predetermined agenda, simply didn't care. Their minds had been made up long before the ultimatum was even delivered. On July 25, just 2 days after sending the list, they abruptly cut off diplomatic ties with Serbia and began mobilizing their army. Now, the clock ticked with increased urgency. Serbia, realizing that war was imminent, desperately turned to its powerful protector, Russia. And Russia, under Tsar Nicholas II, now faced an agonizing decision. On one hand, Russia simply could not allow Serbia to fall. It viewed itself as the unyielding guardian of Slavic nations, and backing down would make Russia appear weak and indecisive. But on the other hand, supporting Serbia meant risking a full-blown war with Germany, and potentially with Austria's allies. Still, the Tsar hesitated. In the agonizing days that followed, a flurry of telegrams flew back and forth between the various European capitals, particularly between Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. The two men were cousins, and they shared a close personal relationship, even affectionately addressing each other as Willie and Nicky in their messages. Both men adamantly claimed they didn't desire war. Both desperately hoped the other would back down. But even as they exchanged personal pleas, their armies continued to move. Russia commenced a partial mobilization on July 29, strategically positioning troops near its border with Austria. Germany perceived this as a direct threat, not just to Austria, but to themselves. And so, Germany responded. On July 31st, Germany issued its own ultimatum, this time directed at Russia: cease mobilizing, or face war. Simultaneously, Germany also issued a stark warning to France: stay neutral in any conflict with Russia or face consequences. Neither country backed down. Russia refused to halt its mobilization. France, grimly, began preparing its own troops. The very next day, August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. 2 days after that, August 2nd, Germany demanded that Belgium, a neutral country, allow German troops to pass through its territory to facilitate an easier attack on France. Belgium, upholding its neutrality, refused. So, on August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. And on August 4th, Germany invaded Belgium. That brazen invasion immediately triggered Britain's entry into the war. compelled by a long-standing agreement to protect Belgian neutrality. In a mere 11 days, 5 major powers were now embroiled in war. The July crisis had reached its terrifying conclusion. The countdown was over, and the Great War had begun. But the true tragedy of those 31 fateful days was this: almost no one believed it would actually happen, even as ultimatums were dispatched and troops were mobilized. Many leaders harbored the naive belief that they could still pull back at the very last minute, that reason would ultimately prevail, that diplomacy would somehow hold, that war would be averted. Or if it occurred, it would be swift and clean. They were catastrophically wrong. Because the systems meticulously put in place, the alliances, the mobilization plans, the secret treaties, were not designed for flexibility. They were built like rigid, unyielding machines. Once turned on, they couldn't be stopped. Consider Germany's Schlieffen Plan, for instance. It was a rigid, unyielding schedule that assumed war with both France and Russia would happen concurrently. Germany had to move with lightning speed to defeat France before turning its forces to Russia. The entire plan hinged on speed and surprise. That's precisely why Germany felt it couldn't afford to wait. Once Russia mobilized, the German military high command insisted they had to act, even if France hadn't yet officially declared war. Waiting, they argued, would spell disaster. So, even as diplomats engaged in frantic talks, even as emperors and kings exchanged increasingly desperate messages, the armies relentlessly kept moving. The train schedules were irrevocably set, the troops were marching, the intricate plans were in motion. And once Belgium was invaded, it ceased to be merely a military issue. It became a profound moral one. The world now viewed Germany as the undeniable aggressor. A neutral country had been attacked, innocent civilians were in grave danger, and cities were burning. Britain, still undecided just days before, now possessed a clear, undeniable reason to fight. The July crisis wasn't simply a diplomatic failure. It was a perfect storm, a convergence of fear, pride, tragic miscommunication, and abysmal timing. Each leader, in their own mind, believed they were acting purely defensively. Austria-Hungary sought to punish Serbia, not to ignite a world war. Germany aimed to support Austria and protect itself from encirclement. Russia desired to protect Serbia and avoid losing face on the international stage. France wished to support its Russian ally and defend against perceived German aggression. Britain sought to prevent Belgium from being crushed and to maintain the delicate European balance. But intentions, tragically, no longer mattered. Because the moment Austria declared war on Serbia, the colossal machine of war was inexorably set in motion. There were fleeting moments when it could have been halted, days when better communication or a little more time might have fundamentally altered the outcome. But the fuse had been irrevocably lit in Silverwood, and by the end of July, the explosion was an absolute certainty. Now, soldiers were boarding trains, rifles slung over their young shoulders. Families stood at bustling stations, waving tearful goodbyes, many genuinely believing their sons would be home by Christmas. Crowds cheered wildly in the streets, draped in national flags, singing anthems of war. It felt, to many, like a grand patriotic adventure. No one, truly, understood what was coming: the mud, the blood, the endless lines of razor wire, the suffocating trenches, the insidious gas, the years of unimaginable slaughter. The world had never witnessed anything remotely like what was about to unfold. The July crisis was over. And the war that was supposed to end all wars had, chillingly, just begun. Chapter 5: The Declarations. War erupts across Europe. The fuse had been fully ignited. The assassination of Archduke Frederick Thorn was no longer merely a localized Balkan crisis. It had, with terrifying speed, transformed into a sprawling European problem. And that problem was now rapidly spiraling into an unprecedented disaster. The July crisis had, in its frantic final days, cracked open the deep, ancient fault lines between old empires, and now those cracks were splitting wide open, tearing the continent apart. The world was holding its collective breath, but not for long. It was the final, fraught days of July 1914. Diplomats raced frantically back and forth between capitals, armed with ultimatums, desperate proposals, and last-ditch attempts to hold things together. But the inexorable machinery of war had already begun to grind forward. Trains were being loaded, orders were being signed, troops were already moving. And the words that would forever change everything had begun to echo across the continent. "We declare war." Austria-Valeria made the first official move. After impatiently awaiting Serbia's reply to its impossible ultimatum, a reply that was, surprisingly, conciliatory in tone, but still not enough for Vienna, Austria decided it was time. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Valeria formally declared war on Serbia. Cannons immediately opened fire on King's Landing, the Serbian capital, as the Austro-Valerian army commenced its invasion. The single shot that killed Frederick Thorn had now escalated into a full-blown war between two countries. But it could not stop there. This was not merely a war between Austria-Valeria and Serbia. Russia, Serbia's powerful, unwavering ally, watched every development with intense scrutiny. The Russians perceived Austria's attack not only as an act of aggression against Serbia but as a direct attempt to completely dominate the Balkans. And Russia had long-standing, deep-seated ambitions in the region. It desired influence, it yearned to protect its Slavic brothers, and perhaps most critically, it simply could not afford to appear weak on the international stage. So, Russia began to mobilize its vast forces. This was not, at least not yet, a formal declaration of war. But it was dangerously close. Russian mobilization was an immense, sprawling operation. Railway lines were activated, soldiers were called up from across the empire, and thousands began to move inexorably toward the western borders. Russia insisted it was only mobilizing against Austria-Valeria, not Germany. But Germany did not believe that for a second. To German military planners, a partial mobilization by Russia made no strategic sense. Russia could not move effectively against Austria without simultaneously threatening Germany. Germany saw this as a trap, a slow, dangerous trap closing in. If Germany waited too long, it might find itself completely surrounded, attacked by both Russia in the east and France in the west. So, Germany immediately demanded that Russia cease mobilizing. But Russia, defiant, did not stop. Germany had spent years meticulously preparing for this exact moment. Every German general knew the plan by heart. It was called the Schlieffen Plan, and it was brutal in its chilling clarity: strike first, strike fast. Knock out France quickly before Russia could fully mobilize its colossal forces, then pivot back and confront Russia. It was a plan built entirely on speed and precision. But it was also a plan that depended on one critical, dangerous assumption: that Germany could bypass French defenses by passing directly through neutral Belgium to reach France. On August 1, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. And 2 days later, on August 3, Germany declared war on France. Europe was unraveling by the hour. At this precarious point, the British were watching with extreme caution. Britain was technically not yet bound to jump into the conflict. Yes, it had understandings with France and Russia, but they weren't ironclad, explicit military alliances. The British government hesitated. They did not want war, not yet, not unless there was a clear, undeniable reason. That reason came, stark and undeniable, on August 4, 1914, when Germany brazenly invaded Belgium. Now, this was fundamentally different. Britain had long held a solemn commitment to protect Belgium's neutrality. That commitment had been signed decades earlier, and when German troops marched through Belgian territory without permission, it was more than just a strategic military move. It was a flagrant violation of international law. British newspapers exploded with furious headlines. Public outrage surged across the nation. In Parliament, the compelling case was made. This wasn't just about alliances anymore. This was about protecting a small, innocent nation from brutal aggression. And so, on August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. Within a single whirlwind week, what had started as a regional crisis had metastasized into a full-blown European war. Germany, Austria-Hungary, France, Russia, Britain, all now locked in a death grip. It was like an unstoppable cascade of dominoes falling, each one hitting the next. But these were not merely wooden tiles. These were nations, ancient empires, millions of precious lives. And it wasn't just Europe anymore. In Africa, colonial troops were being called up, French and British colonies grimly prepared to defend their vast empires. German colonies were put on high alert. In Asia, Japan was watching closely, and across the vast ocean, even countries not yet directly involved, like the United States, were beginning to pay serious attention. The war was spreading inexorably across the globe. In cities across Europe, people poured into the streets. Flags waved furiously, brass bands played stirring anthems. And men in uniforms marched with an almost naive pride, many with smiles on their faces, utterly convinced the war would be over by Christmas. Recruitment posters plastered walls. Rousing speeches were delivered, and young men, caught in the fervor, lined up to enlist, some even lying about their age just to join the fight. There was a strange, almost surreal sense of excitement in the air. National pride had been powerfully awakened. Many genuinely believed they were fighting for justice, for honor, or for their very survival. They did not yet, could not yet, comprehend what kind of war this would truly become. Meanwhile, the generals, with grim determination, began their moves. Germany sent its immense army racing west through Belgium, encountering far more fierce resistance than they had anticipated. The small Belgian army, though vastly outnumbered, fought with surprising determination, and German brutality in occupied towns quickly turned world opinion vehemently against them. French troops, eager to reclaim lost territory like Alsace and Lorraine, launched their own valiant but ill-fated attacks along the eastern border. They suffered devastating losses, their colorful uniforms, raw bravery, and outdated tactics tragically collided with the grim, mechanized reality of modern warfare, machine guns, heavy artillery, and deadly efficiency. In the east, Russian forces began to pour into German territory, but the vast distances, poor planning, and crippling communication breakdowns would soon create a chaos uniquely their own. The war was no longer theoretical. It was real, bloody, fast-moving, and terrifyingly unpredictable. And yet, there was still a pervasive sense that this would be quick. Politicians and generals alike clung to the belief that victory would come swiftly, that one decisive, grand battle would settle everything, that by fall, the soldiers would surely be home. They were tragically wrong. More countries were about to become entangled. The Ottoman Empire was watching, its leadership undecided. Italy remained uncommitted. And other regions, the Balkans, the Middle East, the distant colonies, would soon become new, bloody front lines in a war that was expanding, inexorably, by the day. But at this pivotal moment in early August 1914, the war had officially, terrifyingly, begun. And there was no turning back. The declarations had been made, the alliances triggered, the armies mobilized, the cannons fired. From the muddy, nascent trenches in Belgium to the dense forests of Eastern Europe, to the rolling hills of Serbia and the bustling streets of Paris, the world had changed in just a few short weeks. The age of empires had collided brutally with the age of industrial warfare. This was no longer merely a political crisis. This was the Great War, and it was only just beginning. As the vast German war machine rumbled into action in early August 1914, declaring war on both France and Russia, there was no time for leisurely planning. Every cog was already in motion. Orders were being executed with clockwork precision, and trains laden with troops were thundering across the landscape. This wasn't improvisation. For years, Germany had been meticulously preparing for this exact moment, not in theoretical discussions or patriotic speeches, but in one of the most intricately detailed military strategies ever conceived. Chapter 6: The Iron Hammer That Stumbled, Germany's Failed Lightning Strike. This blueprint for conquest was known as the Schlieffen Plan. It bore the name of its brilliant, albeit long-retired, architect, Count Alfred von Schlieffen. The plan itself was born from a singular, gnawing fear. Germany's greatest nightmare was fighting a war on two fronts simultaneously. To the east lay the vast, slow-mobilizing behemoth of Russia, and to the west, the formidable, vengeful Republic of France. The terrifying prospect of being caught in a deadly vice, squeezed from both sides, haunted the German High Command. The Schlieffen Plan's solution, simple on paper, was anything but in practice: attack first, attack hard, and knock out France quickly, decisively, before Russia had time to fully bring its massive, yet cumbersome, forces to bear. The grand vision was to execute a sweeping, lightning-fast maneuver through neutral Belgium and the Netherlands, then swing down into France like a colossal, unstoppable hammer, aiming to capture Paris within a mere 6 weeks. Germany was utterly convinced it could deliver a crippling knockout blow, believing that if France fell swiftly, they could then pivot their entire might eastward and confront the slower-moving Russian army. Speed, surprise, and unyielding momentum were the core tenets, the absolute keys to victory. But from the very outset, things did not unfold as meticulously planned. For one, the original Schlieffen Plan had actually called for the invasion of both Belgium and the Netherlands. However, when the plan was later meticulously revised by Helmuth von Moltke, Germany's chief of the General Staff at the time, the Dutch component was removed. Germany harbored a strategic desire to preserve Dutch neutrality, allowing them to utilize Dutch ports for vital trade routes throughout the conflict. This seemingly minor alteration, however, rendered the German invasion route significantly narrower, a constriction that would, in time, prove immensely costly. Still, on the fateful day of August 4, 1914, German troops, a vast grey tide, poured across the border into Belgium. Their first significant obstacle was the fortress city of Liège. German generals, brimming with overconfidence, anticipated its fall within a mere 2 days. But the Belgians, defying all expectations, fought back with a ferocity and determination that utterly stunned everyone. The ring of formidable forts surrounding Liège held out for almost 2 excruciating weeks, and every single extra day of Belgian resistance threw Germany's painstakingly timed schedule into disarray. As the Germans relentlessly pushed deeper into Belgium, their army grew increasingly brutal. Civilians were summarily executed, entire villages were set ablaze, and horrifying stories of atrocities began to spread like wildfire across Europe. Whether exaggerated or not, these tales ignited a furious inferno of public outrage, particularly in Britain. Germany's initial hope of a swift, clean campaign was now irrevocably stained by blood and stubborn, unexpected resistance. Meanwhile, France, with a defiant flourish, launched its own offensive along the eastern border. Their objective was a passionate attempt to reclaim Alsace and Lorraine, territories lost decades earlier in the Franco-Prussian War. French troops, resplendent in their bright blue and red uniforms, charged into battle with soaring morale, a testament to their unwavering spirit. But they were met with devastating German firepower, a hail of lead and steel that shredded their ranks. Thousands were mercilessly cut down. France's early, desperate attacks failed miserably, and its army was forced into a painful, bloody retreat. On the surface, Germany's plan appeared to be working. The immense right wing of the German army, the spearhead sweeping through Belgium and northern France, was designed to be overwhelmingly strong, far more potent than the left-wing position near Alsace. That was Schlieffen's original, brilliant vision, a crushing, decisive right hook. But Moltke, in a fateful and subtle shift, had critically weakened this crucial right wing to reinforce the left. It was a seemingly minor adjustment, but it meant that the most vital part of the attack did not possess the overwhelming, irresistible force it desperately needed. And then came Britain. Germany had foolishly clung to the hope that Britain might, somehow, remain aloof from the continental conflict. But when German troops brazenly marched into Belgium, that hope utterly vanished. Britain, with grim determination, declared war. And its small but impeccably trained British Expeditionary Force, BF, landed in France, ready for battle. At the Battle of Mons, British forces bravely clashed with the relentlessly advancing Germans. Though vastly outnumbered, the British held their ground with remarkable tenacity, inflicting heavy casualties before executing a disciplined retreat. It was not a massive victory, but it served to further slow the German advance, once again. And time, relentlessly, was the mortal enemy of the Schlieffen Plan. The German army, an exhausted but unyielding tide, continued its march south and west, pushing the French and British forces relentlessly back toward Paris. But with every hard-won mile gained, their supply lines stretched thinner, growing dangerously attenuated. Soldiers were utterly exhausted, their bodies pushed beyond endurance. Horses, crucial for transport, collapsed from fatigue and starvation. Food and vital ammunition lagged perilously behind schedule. The unfamiliar terrain proved more challenging than anticipated, and the Allied resistance was far fiercer, more desperate than they had ever hoped. By early September, the lead German troops were within a terrifying 30 miles of Paris. The French government, in a state of growing panic, had already fled the capital. A chilling sense of dread spread through the city. This was it, the pivotal moment the Germans had been counting on, the culmination of their daring plan. But Paris, defiantly, did not fall. Instead, something utterly unexpected occurred. French intelligence, utilizing the incredibly new and nascent technology of aerial reconnaissance, made a critical discovery: the German right flank. The very hammer of the Schlieffen Plan was dangerously exposed. Moltke, in another fatal decision, had moved some crucial troops away from the crucial right wing to reinforce the beleaguered forces fighting the Russians in the east. This weakened the already overstretched line, and French General Joseph Joffre, a man of calm resolve, seized his chance. On September 6, 1914, French and British forces launched a desperate, furious counterattack along the Marne River. It caught the Germans completely off guard. Over several brutal, bloody days of fighting, the tide, miraculously, began to turn. German troops, stretched precariously thin and grappling with severe supply problems, began a hesitant retreat. It was the first major turning point of the war. The Battle of the Marne had, against all odds, stopped the German advance in its tracks. Paris was saved. The Schlieffen Plan, this grand, audacious vision of a swift, decisive German victory, had failed, utterly and spectacularly. Germany's retreat did not signify the end of the fighting, it marked the grim end of movement. Both sides, exhausted and bloodied, immediately began to dig in. Trenches, initially hasty, were built deeper, more complex. Barbed wire, miles of it, was rolled out across the ravaged landscape. And soon, a new, horrifying kind of war began, a war of mud, of incessant artillery barrages, of long, drawn-out, agonizing battles where gaining a mere few yards could cost thousands of precious lives. This was not the war anyone had expected. For Germany, the catastrophic failure of the Schlieffen Plan was utterly devastating. They had gambled everything on speed and precision, on a lightning strike, but the fierce Belgian resistance, the timely arrival of British troops, the stubborn, unyielding defense of the French, and the sheer, debilitating exhaustion of the German army had all conspired against them. And now, instead of a short, glorious war, Germany faced its ultimate nightmare, a brutal, prolonged two-front war with no clear path to victory. In the east, Russia, though shaken, was already putting immense pressure on Germany's weaker flank. In the west, France and Britain were regrouping, digging in, and preparing for the long, agonizing haul. The very plan that was supposed to avoid this exact, terrifying situation had, ironically, delivered it instead. Moltke, the man who had modified the plan and overseen its failure, was crushed by the outcome and soon replaced. German morale was severely shaken, but their generals, with grim determination, vowed to continue the fight. The trenches weren't just a fleeting tactic. They swiftly became a haunting symbol of the war itself, a frozen, unyielding line stretching across the breadth of Europe, perpetually filled with fear, suffocating mud, and the stench of death. But in that first, frantic month, before the permanent trenches, before the insidious gas, before the rumbling tanks, there had been a vision, a daring plan, a belief in a swift strike, a conviction that war could be quick and decisively won. That vision, that hope, died at the Marne. The Schlieffen plan had been bold, meticulously calculated, and utterly ruthless. Ultimately, it proved to be impossible. From here on out, the war would not be fast. It would not be clean. And it would most certainly not be over by Christmas. Chapter 7. The Marne, the end of the Blitzkrieg. The German army was a relentless, brutal force, moving with terrifying speed. Town after town crumbled as they stormed through Belgium and into France, mercilessly driving the French armies back and forcing the British Expeditionary Force into a desperate retreat. The audacious Schlieffen plan, despite a few unforeseen setbacks, still seemed inexorably on track. Paris itself was now just over 30 miles away, a tangible prize. The German generals, their eyes gleaming with anticipation, could almost taste victory. But something fundamental was shifting. The lightning advance that had begun with such unstoppable force was visibly starting to falter, to slow. The German troops were utterly exhausted. They had marched hundreds of miles, fighting almost non-stop, their bodies pushed beyond human endurance. Their vital supply lines were stretched dangerously thin, growing increasingly tenuous. Food, ammunition, even fresh horses, all lagged critically behind schedule. Persistent rain and churned mud rendered the roads almost impassable. And most critically, they had overextended themselves. Their lines were precariously thin, and their flanks, the vulnerable sides of their massive army, were dangerously exposed. Still, they pressed forward, fueled by the fading belief that a quick, decisive victory was just around the corner. Inside Paris, a palpable panic had taken hold. The French government, anticipating the worst, had already fled south. Shops were shuttered. People frantically packed what few belongings they could, and a mass exodus from the city began. Many harbored the terrifying fear that the city, their beloved capital, would fall just as Belgium's cities had, swiftly and violently. But the French army was not yet broken. Neither, crucially, were the British. At that pivotal moment, something critical occurred. Something that would irrevocably shift the entire course of the war. A gap, a subtle but fatal rupture, opened up in the formidable German lines. It wasn't immediately obvious. The German First Army, under the command of the ambitious General Alexander von Kluck, had swung too far east of Paris, inadvertently exposing the right side of the main German army. Meanwhile, the Second Army, led by the more cautious General Karl von Bülow, had drifted too far south. Between them, a weak spot emerged, a perilous opening. And this small, seemingly insignificant gap would become the turning point. The French commander-in-chief, General Joseph Joffre, had been laboring under immense pressure. His earlier offensives in Alsace-Lorraine had failed disastrously, costing thousands of lives. But he had not lost hope. He remained calm, calculating, and crucially, willing to adapt to the fluid, terrifying realities of the battlefield. Now, seeing the dangerously exposed German flank, he instantly recognized it as the desperate, fleeting opportunity France so desperately needed. And so, he issued the order for a counterattack. But this was no ordinary assault. It was to be massive, an overwhelming torrent involving over 1 million Allied troops. French armies, powerfully supported by the British Expeditionary Force, would strike the exposed German right flank with everything they possessed. And they had to do it with lightning speed. To pull off this audacious maneuver, Joffre made a bold, almost legendary move. He created a brand new French army, the Sixth Army, virtually from scratch. Troops were rushed in from across the country, pulled from quieter sectors, and perhaps most famously, Parisian taxi drivers were called upon to help ferry thousands of soldiers to the embattled front lines. It became a powerful symbol of France's fierce, unyielding determination, ordinary civilians playing a vital, courageous role in a moment of existential crisis. The battle erupted on September 6, 1914. For the first time in weeks, German troops were no longer advancing. They were fighting desperately to hold their hard-won positions. The Allies launched wave after relentless wave of attacks. At first, the Germans resisted stubbornly, with their usual efficiency. But the pressure kept building, and relentless, agonizing squeeze. More and more Allied troops poured into the breach. French artillery hammered German positions with terrifying accuracy. The British pushed from one side, the French from another. The Germans, still powerful but fatally spread too thin, began to visibly struggle. The battle raged for several agonizing days. Soldiers fought with desperate ferocity in shattered villages, dense forests, and open, cratered fields. The deafening roar of the guns, the screams of the wounded, the pervasive confusion, it was pure chaos. Communication lines broke down, making coordination almost impossible. Trenches, the grim hallmark of the coming war, hadn't even been properly dug yet. The front was a fluid, constantly shifting maelstrom of death. Then, something happened that irrevocably sealed the fate of the German plan. General Moltke, the German chief of staff, was far removed from the brutal reality of the battlefield. He was unable to clearly perceive the unfolding disaster. Reports were scattered, often contradictory, and vital communication lines were weak and unreliable. His crucial orders frequently failed to reach the front lines in time, or at all. Under the immense, unbearable stress, Moltke reportedly suffered a nervous breakdown. Leadership faltered at the worst possible moment. German commanders at the front, realizing the futility of holding their positions and fearing a complete, catastrophic collapse, began a desperate retreat. It was not an organized, disciplined pullback. It was a desperate, panicked effort to avoid being completely surrounded and annihilated. By September 12th, the German army had pulled back across the Aisne River. The Allies, almost miraculously, had won. The victory stunned both sides. For France and Britain, it was a moment of profound, almost unbelievable relief and surging pride. Paris was safe. The nightmare of a quick, devastating German conquest was over. For Germany, it was a crushing, devastating blow. The Schlieffen Plan, their meticulously timed blueprint for swift victory, was utterly, unequivocally dead. This was not merely a battlefield defeat, it was a strategic catastrophe. Germany had failed to knock out France in the opening, crucial weeks of the war. That meant they now had to face the exact, terrifying situation they had tried so desperately hard to avoid: a long, grinding, brutal war on two fronts. Russia was steadily mobilizing in the east, posing a continuous threat. France and Britain were regrouping in the west, digging in for the long haul. And Germany was caught, agonizingly, in between. But the consequences of the Battle of the Marne did not end there. After the German retreat, both sides, with grim determination, began to literally dig in. Soldiers furiously dug trenches to protect themselves from the relentless enemy fire. These trenches were initially conceived to be temporary, merely something to hold the line for a few days. But those few days inexorably stretched into weeks, then months, then years. Trench warfare had begun, and with it came a new, unspeakable kind of horror. The wide, sweeping movements of the early battles were replaced by slow, brutal, agonizing fighting over tiny, insignificant pieces of land. The war became about inches, not miles. Mud, barbed wire, swarms of rats, pervasive disease, these would swiftly become the grim, constant realities of life on the front lines. But all of that, the transformation of war, began right here, at the Marne. The failure of the German advance also brutally shattered the naive illusion that the war would somehow be over by Christmas. People had cheered wildly in the streets when war was declared, believing it would be short, heroic, and glorious. But now, the world began to grasp the chilling truth: this was going to be long, hard, incredibly bloody, and profoundly different from any war that had come before it. The Germans, in their bitter frustration, blamed their high command. Moltke was summarily removed from his position and replaced. Some generals, clinging to a desperate delusion, believed they had been mere days, perhaps even hours, from ultimate victory. They bitterly blamed the critical weakening of the right flank, the unexpected delay in Belgium, the irritating British interference. But the simpler, more brutal truth was this: the plan had catastrophically underestimated everything: the speed and resilience of the Allied response, the sheer stubborn determination of the French, the unexpected mobility of the British forces, and the unpredictable, terrifying chaos that defines war itself. The Allies, while immensely relieved, also grimly understood what was coming. Victory at the Marne had saved France, yes. But it had not, by any stretch, ended the war. It had only, profoundly, changed its very shape. Both sides immediately commenced what would become known as the race to the sea, a frantic, desperate attempt to outflank each other by moving relentlessly northward, all the way to the North Sea. But each desperate move was countered, each audacious attempt blocked. More trenches were dug, deeper and more intricate. The front solidified, freezing into an unyielding, bloody line. From the Swiss border to the sea, a wall of men, mud, and unutterable misery stretched across the ravaged face of Europe. And so, the Battle of the Marne marked the definitive end of one phase of the war, and the terrifying beginning of another. The fast-moving war of maneuver that Germany had so meticulously planned for was gone, vanished like a phantom. In its place came something far darker, something infinitely more destructive. A war of attrition. By halting the German advance, the Allies had saved themselves from immediate, crushing defeat. But in doing so, they had also unwittingly stumbled into a kind of war for which they were utterly unprepared. No one was prepared. The generals would have to desperately invent new strategies on the fly. The soldiers would have to endure the truly unimaginable. And the people back home would have to come to terms with a grim, chilling truth: this war wasn't going away anytime soon. It's strange, almost surreal, to consider that one exposed flank, one fleeting moment of overconfidence, one misstep in a quiet river valley outside Paris, could so fundamentally alter the course of world history. The Battle of the Marne may not be as widely known today as some later, more famous battles, but it was, unequivocally, the first great turning point of the First World War. It did not end the war. It tragically, profoundly, reshaped it. And as the trenches were meticulously dug, and the barbed wire relentlessly rolled out, a new, horrifying chapter was grimly beginning, one that would define the next 4 years of unimaginable suffering and sacrifice. After the Battle of the Marne, the very nature of the war transformed. Germany's audacious dream of a swift victory, a knockout blow, had utterly collapsed. Both sides, exhausted and bloodied, were left scrambling, desperately trying to figure out their next move. The German armies, no longer on the offensive, began digging in, not out of choice, but out of grim necessity. The ground they had gained had to be held, and if the enemy dared to try and reclaim it, they would ensure it would not be easy. Chapter 8: Life in the Mud, the brutal dawn of trench warfare. At first, the trenches were rudimentary, little more than shallow ditches hastily dug by hand, barely wide enough for a man to lie in. But as days bled into weeks, and weeks into agonizing months, these crude ditches grew deeper, wider, and frighteningly complex. Wooden planks were laid down, forming duckboards to walk on, trying to escape the pervasive mire. Sandbags were meticulously stacked, providing fragile cover. Dugouts, crude shelters, were carved into the very sides of the earth. What had begun as a temporary solution quickly morphed into a horrifying, permanent reality. And it wasn't just the Germans. The French and British armies, realizing with a chilling certainty that they would not break through the formidable German lines, began constructing their own elaborate trench systems. Soon, a continuous, jagged line of trenches stretched, unbroken, from the North Sea all the way to the Swiss border, hundreds of miles of mud, razor wire, and unutterable misery. This became known as the Western Front, and it would barely shift for the next 4 grueling years. Life in the trenches wasn't just hard, it was a living hell. Imagine waking up every single day surrounded by mud, not just ordinary dirt and water, but thick, sticky, stinking mud that clung to your boots, soaked through your clothes, and seemed to swallow anything that touched the ground. Rain made everything infinitely worse. Trenches would flood, water rising above your ankles, sometimes even to your knees. Soldiers often had to sleep standing up, leaning against the cold, damp walls, because lying down meant being utterly soaked to the bone. And then there were the rats. Huge, aggressive, and utterly fearless, they thrived in the putrid conditions of the trenches. They gorged themselves on garbage, on the meager scraps of leftover food, and chillingly even on the dead. They would scuttle over sleeping soldiers, chew on uniforms, and bite if disturbed. No one, no matter how vigilant, could escape them. Soldiers desperately tried shooting them, stabbing them, even clubbing them with shovels, but the rats, seemingly endless in number, kept coming. Disease was rampant, an omnipresent threat. One of the most horrifying afflictions was trench foot, a debilitating condition caused by standing in cold, wet, unsanitary conditions for too long. The skin on a soldier's feet would rot, turn black, and in severe cases, necessitate amputation. Hygiene was almost impossible to maintain. There were no proper toilets, just crude holes dug in the ground. Flies swarmed everywhere, thick and buzzing, attracted by the pervasive filth. Dysentery, typhus, and lice outbreaks were distressingly common. The air itself was a sickening concoction, the stench of sweat, mud, rotting flesh, and unwashed bodies. Food was another daily struggle. Supplies had to be brought to the front lines under constant, murderous enemy fire, so meals were often basic, cold, and unappetizing. Hard biscuits, tins of tough bully beef, and weak, lukewarm tea were the common fare. Sometimes, the food was moldy or infested with maggots. Fresh meat and vegetables were a rare, distant luxury. Water had to be carried in, often tasting heavily of the chlorine added to kill bacteria. But worse than all of that was the constant, gnawing threat of death. Trenches, though offering some protection, were also insidious death traps. Artillery shells exploded above and around them with deafening force, sending deadly shrapnel in every conceivable direction. Snipers, cold and patient, watched from across no man's land, waiting for the slightest movement. A soldier daring to lift his head above the parapet, even for a fleeting second, risked being instantly shot. Gas attacks became a terrifying new weapon, striking without warning. Clouds of insidious chlorine or blistering mustard gas would drift silently in, burning lungs, blinding eyes, and leaving soldiers choking, or worse, succumbing to a slow, agonizing death. There was no true safety. Every so often, a chilling order would echo down the line. Prepare to go over the top. That grim command meant climbing out of the relative safety of the trench and charging across the desolate, blasted expanse of no man's land toward the enemy lines. No man's land was a nightmarish wasteland, churned earth, craters from exploding shells, tangled barbed wire, thick mud, and the decaying bodies of the fallen. Charging through it was an act of almost suicidal futility. Machine guns mercilessly mowed down entire waves of men before they even reached halfway across. Some attacks lasted only minutes. Others dragged on for hours of unimaginable horror. And when it was finally over, whether the attack technically succeeded or failed, the surviving soldiers returned to the trenches, if they made it back alive. The mental toll of trench warfare was just as brutal, if not more so, than the physical suffering. Soldiers lived with constant, crippling fear of the next incoming shell, fear of the next insidious gas attack, fear of being called up for an impossible assault. Many developed what was then known as shell shock, what we now understand as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. They would shake uncontrollably, become mute, lose the ability to walk or speak, or scream uncontrollably in their sleep. Others became numb, utterly detached from the horrifying reality around them. Doctors in those early days didn't always know how to treat them and often, tragically, didn't even try. But somehow, despite this ceaseless, soul-crushing horror, soldiers endured. They painstakingly built routines to survive. They wrote poignant letters home. They shared dark, gallows humor jokes. They meticulously cleaned their weapons, shaved, played cards, and sang mournful songs. Christmas 1914 even brought a fleeting, unexpected miracle in some sectors along the front. Soldiers from opposing sides climbed out of their trenches, met in the middle of no man's land, and exchanged small gifts. They played football, shared meager food, and sang carols together. For a brief, precious moment, the war paused, and humanity, against all odds, broke through the madness. But such moments were rare, and agonizingly short-lived. As the war relentlessly dragged on, the trenches grew deeper, the barbed wire thicker, and the attacks more brutally deadly. Engineers added more intricate features. Dugouts that burrowed deep underground, secure command posts, rudimentary field hospitals, and vast ammo storage areas. Trenches were organized into complex, interconnected systems, front lines, support trenches, reserve trenches, all linked by communication trenches. Moving through them was like navigating a bewildering maze. Still, the basic, miserable life of a trench soldier remained unchanged: wet, cold, hungry, and perpetually afraid. Rotations offered some small relief. Soldiers didn't stay on the front line forever. Typically, they endured a few harrowing days on the front, then were rotated to a reserve trench, then to the rear for a brief, precious rest. But even in the rear, the constant, low rumble of the guns was a chilling reminder. Even behind the lines, they were never truly safe. And for those left at home, the true, unspeakable reality of trench life was almost impossible to imagine. Posters and propaganda painted war as heroic, noble, and glorious. Newspapers offered short, sanitized updates with little genuine detail. But the letters sent back from the front told a starkly different story, some filled with forced cheer and desperate optimism, others with unvarnished despair. Families waited anxiously for news. Some received precious letters, others received dreaded telegrams with the chilling words, "We regret to inform you." Trench warfare wasn't confined to just one location, though it is most famously associated with the Western Front. Trenches also appeared in parts of Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and other fronts. But it was in France and Belgium that the line remained stubbornly stuck, and trench life became the horrifying, enduring symbol of the war. Generals and politicians back home, clinging to outdated ideas, still hoped for elusive breakthroughs. They launched massive offensives, throwing hundreds of thousands of men into battles, desperately trying to break the agonizing deadlock. But again and again they failed. The cost was horrific: fields soaked with the blood of countless men for the gain of a mere few hundred yards, only for a relentless counterattack to push the line back days later. In the trenches, the soldiers, with a grim, bitter irony, called it the meat grinder. Still, they followed orders. They fought. They died. And they waited. By 1915, it became chillingly clear that trench warfare wasn't just a temporary phase. It was the new, brutal normal. The war that was supposed to be fast and glorious had devolved into something slow, gruesome, and endless. No one had planned for this. No one had imagined it would drag on for so long. And terrifyingly, no one seemed to know how to end it. New weapons were introduced, desperate attempts to break the stalemate, insidious poison gas, terrifying flamethrowers, and ever more powerful artillery. But these only served to make the trenches more terrible, not less. Tanks would appear later, but not yet in a way that truly revolutionized the war. The world had entered a new kind of conflict, not one of sweeping cavalry charges or noble duels, but one of mud, razor wire, ceaseless noise, and agonizing waiting. A war of endurance, of attrition, of grim survival. In the end, trench warfare defined the First World War more profoundly than any other single element. It was where millions of men lived, fought, and died. It was where hope faded and horror became the grim, everyday normal. And it was where an entire generation was irrevocably changed forever, not just by the bullets and bombs, but by what they endured day after brutal day in the mud, under constant fire, clinging to the faint, desperate hope of making it home. Chapter 9. The Western Front, a War of Attrition. By the time trench warfare had fully taken hold, the Western Front was no longer about audacious, bold maneuvers or swift, decisive victories. It had, instead, mutated into something far darker, something slower, and infinitely more agonizing, a war of attrition. The goal was no longer to outsmart the enemy with clever strategy or brilliant planning. It was to systematically wear them down, to outlast them, to bleed them dry. After the trenches were meticulously dug, stretching an unbroken, hideous line from the North Sea to the Swiss border, both sides settled in, literally and psychologically. Generals, clinging to a desperate, fading hope, ordered attack after attack, convinced that just one big push could finally shatter the enemy's line. Just one more offensive, they believed, would create that elusive gap, lead to that decisive breakthrough, and finally, mercifully, end the war. But that breakthrough, truly, never materialized. What did happen was thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, of men dying for the gain of a mere few yards of ground. And even when ground was gained, it was often brutally lost again, just days later, in a relentless counterattack. Over and over, this horrific cycle repeated, a sickening, endless grind. Every single attack began in the same chilling, predictable way. Artillery would pound the enemy trenches for hours, sometimes for days on end. The stated idea was to utterly destroy their defenses, flatten their barbed wire, and kill as many soldiers as humanly possible before the infantry moved in. Shells screamed overhead with a terrifying, banshee wail, exploding with deafening booms that shook the very earth, sending deadly shrapnel flying in every direction. The ground vibrated violently, the sky turned a murky gray with acrid smoke, and entire sections of trenches were reduced to pulverized rubble. Then came the shrill, piercing whistles. Soldiers, with grim resignation, would climb over the top of their trenches and begin to charge across no man's land. They ran directly into a torrent of gunfire, through tangled barbed wire, and stumbled into the gaping, treacherous shell holes. Many, heartbreakingly, never even made it halfway. Machine guns, with their terrifying, relentless chatter, cut them down in seconds, scything through entire waves of men. Those few who did manage to reach the enemy line found that the artillery had, more often than not, done far less damage than hoped. The barbed wire was often still intact, the trenches still full of enemy soldiers, grimly ready to fight. And when the attack failed, as most tragically did, the survivors stumbled back through the thick, clinging mud, wounded, shell-shocked, and fewer in number. Then, the very next day, it might happen again. And again. And again. That's precisely what made the Western Front so utterly horrifying. It wasn't just one colossal, terrible battle. It was a constant, soul-destroying grind of small, desperate attacks, massive, futile offensives, terrifying surprise raids, and endless, mind-numbing shelling. A never-ending wave of death and destruction with no discernible end in sight. It wasn't just the soldiers who suffered. The very land itself was utterly destroyed. Trees were shredded into splintered stumps, Once verdant fields were transformed into barren, cratered wastelands. Entire villages were reduced to desolate piles of stone. Nothing green remained. No birds sang. No animals scurried. Just mud and a chilling silence, punctuated only by the earth-shattering thunder of explosions. And through it all, the men remained in the trenches. Some were fresh recruits, barely trained, their eyes wide with terror at what was to come. Others were hardened veterans, their faces etched with the grim experiences of months or even years of war. Numb to the horrors surrounding them, every single soldier carried the crushing weight of fear of being killed, fear of being horribly wounded, fear of that dreaded order to go over the top, fear of never seeing home again. Casualties weren't always caused directly by combat. Disease, devastating accidents, and prolonged exposure claimed countless lives. So did despair. Some soldiers simply broke down completely. Some, with desperate courage, refused to go forward. Some, in a desperate attempt to escape, tried to injure themselves. Others never returned from a patrol, simply vanishing into the endless night, consumed by darkness and the suffocating fear. And yet, for every man lost, another, with grim inevitability, was sent to replace him. The war machine, relentless and unfeeling, kept grinding. Nations back home also began to feel the crushing pressure. At first, people were full of patriotic hope. They clung to the belief in swift victory, cheering their departing soldiers. But as the months dragged on and the casualty lists grew longer, that initial hope began, inexorably, to fade. Streets that had once rung with parades and triumphant songs became filled with a somber silence and the pervasive mourning of lost lives. Women wore black, their faces etched with grief. Children, with innocent eyes, repeatedly asked when their fathers would finally come home. The answers, chillingly, never came. Governments, acutely aware that public morale was plummeting, resorted to elaborate posters and stirring speeches to keep the public steadfastly on their side. They issued urgent calls for sacrifice, duty, and courage. Newspapers, with their carefully curated narratives, spun tales of individual heroism, but the brutal truth was becoming harder to conceal. So many were dying, so few gains were being made, and still the front line remained stubbornly, immovably frozen. One of the most infamous, most harrowing examples of this endless suffering came in 1916 with the Battle of Verdun. The Germans launched a massive, brutal assault on the French lines, hoping, chillingly, to bleed France white, to kill so many French soldiers that the country would simply collapse from sheer exhaustion and loss. The French, with an indomitable spirit, knew they absolutely could not afford to lose Verdun and vowed to hold the line, no matter the cost. What followed was one of the longest and bloodiest battles in human history. For 10 agonizing months, the two sides fought over the same shattered hills, the same pulverized forts, and the same ruined villages. Trenches were taken, lost, and then grimly retaken again. Shells fell by the millions, turning the landscape into a lunar surface. Bodies piled up in grotesque mounds, and yet either side broke. The cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of men were killed or wounded for almost no discernible change in position. And still, the war dragged on. Later that same year, the British launched their own massive offensive, a desperate, valiant push along the Somme River. It was intended to relieve the immense pressure on the French at Verdun and, finally, to break through the formidable German lines. The first day of the Battle of the Somme became the bloodiest day in British military history. Over 57,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded on that single, horrific day. The battle continued for months. Villages were fought over one by one, reduced to rubble. Shells fell relentlessly. Night and day. Rain transformed everything into a thick, clinging sludge. By the end, more than 1 million men from all sides were dead or wounded, and the front line? It had moved only a pitiful few miles. These battles were just 2 horrifying examples. There were countless others: Ypres, Passchendaele, Loos, each one filled with unimaginable horror. each one indelibly marked by mud, razor wire, blood, and excruciating pain. This was the chilling reality of the Western Front, a war that had become a meat grinder. A place where human lives were expendable, spent like bullets. A war of numbers, of logistics, of sheer, desperate endurance. Generals kept planning new attacks, devising new strategies, developing new weapons, but the core, brutal reality of it never changed. Men were sent forward, many did not return, and when one grim offensive was over, another one inevitably began. This wasn't the kind of war anyone had expected before 1914. Wars, historically, had been short, with quick, decisive battles and clear outcomes. This was something utterly else, a war where victory wasn't measured by territory gained, but by how many enemy soldiers you could kill, and whether your side could simply keep fighting longer than they could. That, chillingly, is what made it a war of attrition. Germany, clinging to a desperate hope, believed that if they could maintain pressure on France and Britain long enough, those countries would simply collapse. France, with grim determination, thought that with enough resolve, they could eventually push the Germans out. Britain believed that their superior resources would, in time, wear down the Central Powers. Everyone hoped that just a little more sacrifice would bring ultimate victory. But none of them truly knew when it would end, or how much more would be tragically lost before it did. And as the years relentlessly passed, the cost kept rising. Millions of soldiers lay dead, millions more wounded, many with horrific injuries they would carry for life, limbs lost, faces disfigured, minds shattered. Entire towns back home were emptied of their young men. The war was no longer about grand ideals or noble causes. It was, for the men in the trenches, about sheer survival. It was about enduring one more bombardment, holding one more godforsaken trench, digging in and somehow holding on. And still, even in the darkest, most despairing days, soldiers found desperate ways to cope. They shared precious cigarettes. They wrote poignant poetry. They found grim humor in the smallest things, nicknames, songs, dark jokes, anything to make the endless days bearable, to remind themselves that they were still human in a world that seemed to have forgotten what that meant. By now, it was agonizingly clear to everyone, this war would not end with one great, triumphant victory. It would end only when one side could simply no longer continue, when the crushing weight of death, loss, and destruction became utterly too much to bear. And on the Western Front, that unbearable weight grew heavier with every passing day, leaving soldiers to freeze to death in their threadbare coats, their boots stiff with ice. Equipment failed in the cold, horses collapsed, even guns jammed. In the searing summer heat, the sun baked the land, and disease spread rapidly through the unsanitary camps. Dysentery, typhus, and lice plagued the troops relentlessly. Death, chillingly, didn't always come from bullets. Not the politicians, should ultimately control the country. Lenin was the leader of the Bolsheviks, a radical political group that fiercely believed in total revolution. At first, their numbers were small, but as the provisional government stumbled, the Bolsheviks rapidly gained support. People were desperate. They wanted someone, anyone, who could end the unimaginable suffering. And Lenin promised to do just that. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks made their decisive move. They launched a nearly bloodless coup in Petrograd. They stormed government buildings, arrested key leaders, and declared a new government, one, they claimed, run by the people for the people. In reality, it would be ruthlessly controlled by the Bolsheviks themselves, and very soon, Lenin would become the most powerful man in all of Russia. One of Lenin's very first acts as the new leader was to pull Russia entirely out of the war. He firmly believed the country simply could not survive if the fighting continued. He immediately sent negotiators to Germany to hammer out a peace deal. It was not easy. Germany, in a position of strength, demanded huge, humiliating concessions. The Russians, utterly defeated and desperate, had no choice but to agree. In March 1918, they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Russia was forced to give up massive amounts of land: Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, and significant parts of Poland. It was a devastatingly high price, but the war, at long last, was finally over for Russia. The collapse of the Eastern Front irrevocably changed everything. Germany could now shift its vast number of troops from the east to the Western Front. This gave them a temporary, crucial advantage. For a fleeting moment, it looked as though they might just turn the tide against France and Britain before the Americans could arrive in full force. But it didn't last. The new strength on the Western Front wasn't enough to win the war, and Germany itself was facing its own mounting internal problems, much like Russia had. Meanwhile, Russia descended into profound chaos. The Bolshevik Revolution, far from bringing peace, ignited a brutal civil war. Forces loyal to the old regime, known as the Whites, fiercely fought the Bolsheviks, known as the Reds. Foreign powers, including Britain, France, and the US, even sent troops to support the Whites, desperately hoping to stop the terrifying spread of communism. The fighting tore the country apart. Villages were destroyed, millions died, and hunger and disease spread like wildfire. But eventually, the Bolsheviks, with their ruthless determination, won. By the early 1920s, Lenin and his devoted followers controlled most of the former Russian Empire. They audaciously renamed it the Soviet Union. A new kind of state had been born, a communist one. It was, theoretically, based on ideas of equality and workers' power, but in practice, it swiftly became a one-party system where dissent was brutally crushed and freedom was severely limited. The Russian Revolution didn't just change Russia, it changed the entire world. It inspired revolutionaries everywhere, terrifying governments across Europe, and marked the chilling beginning of a long, uneasy, and deeply suspicious relationship between the capitalist West and the communist East. That profound tension would shape much of the 20th century. But during World War I, the revolution's most immediate and profound effect was the collapse of the Eastern Front. With Russia out of the war, the map of Europe began to visibly shift. The Allies lost a key partner but, in a strange way, also no longer had to support a failing, unstable empire. The vacuum left by Russia was swiftly, powerfully filled by the United States and its burgeoning influence. In the end, the fall of Russia did not save Germany. It did not change the ultimate outcome of the war. But it powerfully demonstrated the destructive power of internal collapse. A war that had started between nations had now broken nations apart from the inside. Armies didn't just fight in trenches anymore. They fought against the very governments that sent them there. From the snowy, desolate fields of Russia to the muddy, suffocating trenches of France. The world was changing faster than anyone had imagined. Empires were falling, new ideologies were rising, and the old order of kings and emperors was coming to a definitive end. The war wasn't just about borders, it was about what kind of world would emerge in its wake. And that world was still, uncertainly, taking shape. After years of slow, agonizing decline, the Ottoman Empire was no longer the mighty force it had once been. By the time the First World War exploded across Europe in 1914, many grimly considered the Ottomans the sick man of Europe. Their sprawling empire stretched across the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Europe, but it was riddled with deep internal problems, ethnic divisions, and pervasive political uncertainty. Still, it held immense strategic importance. The empire's vast location controlled vital trade routes, crucial waterways, and territories that both sides of the escalating war desperately coveted. As the fighting intensified across Europe's ravaged battlefields and Russia's immense, desolate plains, it became chillingly clear that the Ottomans could not remain on the sidelines for long. Chapter 11: The Sultan's Gambit: How the Middle East Became a New Front. At the very outset of the war, the Ottoman leadership was deeply torn. Some high-ranking officials fervently desired to maintain strict neutrality, to avoid dragging the already fragile empire into a devastating European conflict. Others, particularly those within the powerful ruling elite known as the Young Turks, were convinced that joining the war, if they chose the right side, could be a golden opportunity to restore the empire's flagging strength. They saw it as a desperate chance to recover lost lands, perhaps even gain new ones, and to re-establish their once formidable influence on the world stage. But the critical question loomed: which side to choose? Britain, France, and Russia were undeniably powerful, but the Ottomans harbored a long, bitter history of conflict with Russia. The two empires had fought numerous wars over disputed territories in the Caucasus region and the Balkans. Russia had always, relentlessly, coveted control over the Turkish Straits, the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, vital waterways connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Losing those strategic straits would have utterly crippled the Ottoman Empire. There was a deep, ingrained mistrust. The Ottomans had no desire to inadvertently help an old, dangerous enemy grow even stronger. So, when Germany came knocking, with enticing offers and promises, the Ottomans listened intently. Germany had been meticulously courting the Ottoman Empire for years, sending military advisors, investing heavily in railroads, and painstakingly building strong economic ties. The Germans offered modern weapons, advanced training, and enticing promises. If the Ottomans joined the Central Powers, Germany vowed they would protect Ottoman territory and perhaps even help them expand it. It was a deeply tempting offer, especially as German armies scored impressive early victories and Russia looked increasingly shaky. Secret negotiations began in earnest. But the final, decisive push came in the dramatic form of two German warships. In August 1914, just days after the war erupted, two powerful German cruisers, the Goeben and the Breslau, fled desperately from relentless British pursuit in the Mediterranean. They raced toward the Ottoman-controlled Dardanelles, seeking sanctuary. The Ottomans, in a diplomatic charade, allowed them in, disingenuously claiming they had purchased the ships from Germany and even giving them new Turkish names and flying Ottoman flags. But everyone silently knew the truth. They were still German ships, manned by German crews. When those very ships later brazenly bombarded Russian ports in the Black Sea, it became painfully obvious: the Ottomans were entering the war. And they had definitively picked their side. In late October 1914, the Ottoman Empire officially joined the Central Powers. Almost immediately, the war spread far beyond Europe. The Middle East, the Caucasus, and parts of North Africa swiftly became new, brutal battlegrounds. The old Ottoman territories, already under immense pressure from internal revolts and simmering colonial ambitions, were about to be dragged into a much larger, far more destructive storm. One of the first major fronts to erupt was in the Caucasus, where Ottoman forces clashed violently with Russia. The terrain was incredibly harsh: towering mountains, deep, unforgiving snow, and bitter, soul-numbing cold. Many Ottoman soldiers were tragically ill-equipped for such brutal winter conditions, and their leadership, tragically, made a series of disastrous strategic decisions. In early 1915, they launched an ambitious offensive at Sarikamish, desperately hoping to catch Russian forces off guard. But it swiftly devolved into a monumental disaster. The plan was overly complicated, vital supplies quickly ran out, and countless soldiers simply froze to death in the relentless snow. The Russians, seizing the moment, counterattacked, and tens of thousands of Ottoman troops were lost, killed, or captured. But the defeat at Sarikamish didn't just cripple the army. It had horrifying, far-reaching consequences for innocent civilians. After the disaster, Ottoman leaders, seeking scapegoats, viciously blamed local Armenian communities, falsely accusing them of aiding the Russians. Suspicions swiftly escalated into brutal violence. In 1915, the Ottoman government began a brutal, systematic campaign of mass arrests, forced deportations, and wholesale killings. What followed was one of the darkest chapters of the war: the Armenian Genocide. Over 1 million Armenians were driven from their ancestral homes, forced onto agonizing death marches, or outright executed. The empire cynically used the chaos of war to carry out what it euphemistically called relocation. But in reality, it was a systematic, horrific destruction. Families were torn apart. Entire villages were wiped out, and the world, consumed by the overwhelming chaos of the global war, largely looked away. Meanwhile, other parts of the Ottoman Empire were erupting into widespread conflict. In the West, British and French strategists desperately sought ways to swiftly knock the Ottomans out of the war. One audacious idea was to attack the Dardanelles and seize control of the Straits. If successful, it would open a vital supply route to Russia and exert direct pressure on Istanbul, the Ottoman capital. The result was the Gallipoli campaign, a massive, ill-fated amphibious assault by Allied forces in 1915. British, French, Australian, and New Zealand troops landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula, confidently expecting a quick, decisive victory. What they encountered instead was months of unmitigated bloodshed. The Ottomans, under the brilliant leadership of military commander Mustafa Kemal, who would later become revered as Ataturk, the founding father of modern Turkey, were grimly dug in and fought with a terrifying ferocity. The terrain was unforgivingly steep and rocky, the Allies struggled desperately to advance, supplies were woefully limited, and disease spread like wildfire through the cramped, unsanitary encampments. The campaign rapidly devolved into a brutal stalemate, eerily similar to the agonizing trench warfare on the Western Front. After nearly a year of savage fighting and over 250,000 casualties on each side, the Allies, with grim resignation, finally gave up and withdrew. Gallipoli became a haunting symbol of both heroic resistance and catastrophic military failure. For the Ottomans, it was a rare and vital victory, a powerful sign that they could still defend their homeland. But the war didn't stop there. The Middle East transformed into a vast, constantly shifting battlefield. In Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, British forces boldly invaded Ottoman territory to secure vital oil supplies and protect crucial trade routes to India. At first, the British advanced swiftly, capturing key towns and pushing toward Baghdad. But they dangerously overextended themselves. In 1916, an entire British Indian army was surrounded and tragically forced to surrender at the town of Kut. It was one of the worst defeats the British suffered in the entire war. The Ottomans, for a time, held strong, but like everywhere else, their hard-won victories came at a terrible, unsustainable cost. As the war relentlessly dragged on, internal cracks began to appear within the Ottoman Empire. It was fighting on far too many fronts with far too few resources. Its economy was rapidly collapsing, food shortages were rampant, and disease and famine spread virulently across cities and the countryside alike. The army was stretched perilously thin, and vital supplies simply couldn't reach distant areas. And in the vast, desolate deserts of Arabia, something unexpected was stirring. The British, cunningly hoping to weaken the Ottomans from within, began actively supporting Arab nationalist movements. Many Arab leaders had grown increasingly resentful of oppressive Ottoman rule, especially as Turkish officials relentlessly tried to centralize power. The British, in a calculated move, promised independence in exchange for rebellion. With British weapons, glittering gold, and the crucial help of enigmatic officers like T. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, Arab fighters launched daring guerrilla attacks against Ottoman garrisons and vital railways. It wasn't a numerically large army, but it created immense chaos, forced the Ottomans to divert desperately needed troops, and profoundly undermined their control in key regions. Back in Istanbul, the government clung on, but the costs were simply unbearable. Hundreds of thousands had perished, the countryside was utterly devastated, and many parts of the empire were under foreign occupation or in open, bloody rebellion. Yet still, with grim resolve, the Ottomans kept fighting. They had thrown their lot in with Germany and Austria-Hungary, and they were, agonizingly, too deep to pull out now. By 1917, things were undeniably falling apart. The British retook Kut and marched triumphantly into Baghdad. In Palestine, they advanced steadily north, pushing Ottoman forces back. In the Arabian Peninsula, rebel fighters seized cities and severely disrupted supply lines. One by one, ancient Ottoman territories slipped away. The empire was bleeding out. Then, in 1918, everything finally unraveled. Germany was on the brink of total collapse. Austria-Hungary was actively falling apart. And the Ottomans, utterly exhausted and irrevocably broken, finally gave in. In October 1918, they signed an armistice with the Allies. The war was over for them, at least. But the peace that followed would prove just as painful, if not more so, than the war itself. After the armistice, Allied forces occupied significant parts of the empire. The once great Ottoman realm was carved up by foreign powers. The British and French, with callous disregard, redrew the map of the Middle East, drawing new borders with little to no consideration for existing history, deep-rooted cultures, or local identities. The promises made during the war to Arab leaders for independence were callously broken, tensions simmered, revolts flared up, and a young Turkish nationalist movement, again led by the formidable Mustafa Kemal, would soon rise to fiercely resist foreign control. For the Ottoman Empire, World War I was the final, fatal blow. It didn't just lose territory. It ceased to exist. In its place, new nations would rise, borders would be redrawn, and a century of brutal conflict in the Middle East would begin. The war had transformed the region into a devastating battlefield, but the true, long-lasting consequences were only just beginning. The Ottoman decision to enter the war had seemed like a bold, desperate move for survival and restoration. But by the end, it had utterly destroyed the very thing it aimed to save. The Middle East was forever changed. And the bitter legacy of that decision would echo long, long after the last shot was fired. Chapter 12, Gallipoli, the Allies' Folly. By early 1915, the war had already bogged down into a brutal, bloody, and soul-crushing stalemate on the Western Front. Soldiers were digging ever deeper into their muddy trenches, either side making any real, meaningful progress. The Eastern Front was a vast, chaotic, and unpredictable expanse, and now the Ottoman Empire had decisively joined the war, opening up new, treacherous fronts in the Middle East and the Caucasus. But despite all the ceaseless movement and bloodshed, the war was, undeniably, stuck. The Allies, primarily Britain, France, and Russia, desperately sought a way to break this agonizing deadlock. They needed a bold, audacious move, something that could potentially knock one of the Central Powers out of the war entirely, and decisively shift the balance of power. That's when the ill-fated idea of Gallipoli was born. The plan started with a deceptively simple goal: to open up a new front by launching a surprise attack on the Ottoman Empire from the south. By capturing the Dardanelles Strait, a narrow, vital strip of water connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Sea of Marmara, the Allies hoped to open a crucial supply route to Russia, which was rapidly running low on essential weapons and ammunition. More than that, they genuinely believed a successful attack could completely knock the Ottomans out of the war, forcing them into a humiliating surrender. It sounded incredibly ambitious, but it also seemed, to many, perfectly doable. The Ottomans had already shown undeniable signs of weakness, especially after the catastrophic disaster at Sarikamish. Allied leaders were convinced that with a strong naval assault and a swift, decisive land invasion, they could seize the straits, march triumphantly toward the Ottoman capital of Constantinople, and compel a surrender. Winston Churchill, who was First Lord of the Admiralty at the time, was one of the plan's most vocal and fervent supporters. He pushed hard for a purely naval assault on the Dardanelles, convinced that a mere show of overwhelming power from the sea could easily break through Ottoman defenses. In February 1915, the British and French navies began relentlessly bombarding Ottoman forts along the straits. At first, the operation seemed promising. The initial bombardments damaged some forts and forced back Ottoman gunners. But the deeper the Allied ships ventured into the treacherous straits, the more problems they encountered. The Ottomans had, unbeknownst to the Allies, meticulously laid hidden mines in the water, and their coastal defenses proved to be far stronger and more resilient than expected. On March 18th, a major assault by Allied warships ended in utter disaster. Several battleships were sunk or severely damaged by mines and relentless artillery fire. The naval-only strategy had failed miserably. It became painfully clear that a large-scale land invasion would be desperately needed if the Allies wanted to seize control of the Dardanelles. So, the plan pivoted. Instead of relying solely on ships, the Allies decided to land troops directly onto the Gallipoli Peninsula, which formed the northern bank of the strait. If they could secure the peninsula, they could silence the Ottoman guns and finally allow their navy to pass through unimpeded. The idea, on paper, sounded logical. But in practice, it tragically morphed into one of the most disastrous and poorly executed campaigns of the entire war. On April 25, 1915, thousands of Allied troops began landing on the rugged shores of Gallipoli. The main landings occurred in several locations, including Cape Helles at the southern tip and a narrow, deadly beach later known as Anzac Cove. The soldiers came from all corners of the vast British Empire: seasoned British troops, brave French colonial forces, stoic Indian regiments, and the newly formed Anzacs, which stood for the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. For many of them, this was their very first terrifying experience of combat. They had trained for months, filled with the naive belief that the Ottomans would be weak, disorganized, and easily overcome. But the brutal reality was starkly different. The Ottomans were ready. They had been meticulously observing the Allied preparations and had grimly dug in along the formidable cliffs and ridges. Under the brilliant, decisive leadership of commanders like Mustafa Kemal, they had prepared strong, dug-in defensive positions. When the Allied troops came ashore, they were immediately met with incredibly steep terrain, relentless machine gun fire raining down from above, and utterly chaotic landings. The beaches were narrow, dangerously exposed, and offered little to no cover. Many soldiers, heartbreakingly, didn't even make it off their boats. What was supposed to be a swift and decisive strike rapidly devolved into an unspeakable nightmare. The fighting quickly settled into the same grim, soul-destroying pattern as the Western Front. Trenches were hastily dug, soldiers endured constant, terrifying shelling, relentless sniper fire, and brutal, often hand-to-hand combat. The terrain was rocky and parched in summer, freezing and muddy in winter. Vital supplies were scarce, clean water severely limited. Swarms of flies, pervasive lice, and rampant disease made life in the trenches utterly miserable. The searing heat brought clouds of insects and the sickening stench of unburied bodies. The bitter cold brought frostbite and pneumonia. Soldiers suffered endlessly, and thousands died. Not just from bullets and bombs, but from horrific infections and sheer, crushing exhaustion. The Allies had utterly, catastrophically underestimated the Ottomans' will and ability to resist. Every desperate attempt to advance was met with fierce, unrelenting counterattacks. Even small, hard-won gains came at an immense, unacceptable cost. The crucial high ground, especially key ridges and hills like Chunik Bair and Achi Baba, remained stubbornly in Ottoman hands, granting them a constant, deadly advantage. For months, the two sides traded fire, but made almost no real, meaningful progress. It was trench warfare, once again, but in a different, equally horrifying setting. One of the most infamous moments came in August 1915, during a large Allied offensive designed to finally break the stalemate. The plan was to attack multiple points simultaneously and, at last, seize the crucial ridges. The fighting was incredibly intense, especially around a place chillingly called Lone Pine, where Australian troops, after days of brutal, close-quarters combat, managed to capture some Ottoman trenches. But the broader offensive failed miserably. The Ottomans, with grim determination, held on. Thousands of men died for only a few hundred yards of devastated ground. It became chillingly clear the Allies weren't going to win. As the agonizing months dragged on, morale completely collapsed. Troops who had arrived full of youthful energy now spent their days consumed by fear and misery. Commanders rotated in and out, strategies shifted constantly. But the dire situation remained unchanged. Supplies ran dangerously low. Winter arrived, bringing relentless rain, snow, and devastating flooding. Trenches filled with icy water. And soldiers froze in their boots. Still, no breakthrough came. By December 1915, after 8 long, horrific months of fighting, Allied leaders made the painful, humiliating decision to evacuate. The campaign had failed, utterly and completely. Quietly and carefully, they began pulling troops off the peninsula. To their surprise, the evacuation itself went remarkably smoothly, perhaps the only part of the entire campaign that worked as meticulously planned. By January 1916, the last Allied troops had left Gallipoli. The operation was over. The cost was staggering. More than 250,000 Allied soldiers had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. The Ottoman losses were just as high. For every foot of ground gained or lost, thousands had paid with their lives. And yet, the front line had barely moved. Gallipoli had achieved none of its original goals. The Dardanelles remained firmly under Ottoman control, the vital supply route to Russia stayed blocked, and the ambitious idea of knocking the Ottomans out of the war was gone, a bitter, distant memory. For the Allies, Gallipoli was a profound humiliation. It starkly exposed poor planning, a gross underestimation of the enemy, and the terrible, terrible cost of overconfidence. Winston Churchill, who had so passionately championed the campaign, was forced to resign from his influential post. Many questioned how such a catastrophic failure could have happened, and how so many precious lives had been senselessly thrown away for such pitiful, insignificant gains. But for the Ottoman Empire, it was something entirely different. Gallipoli was a rare, hard-won moment of profound triumph. Against all odds, they had heroically defended their homeland. The victory provided them with an immense morale boost at a time when their empire was otherwise crumbling around them. It also launched the meteoric rise of Mustafa Kemal, whose decisive leadership during the campaign made him an undeniable national hero and powerfully set the stage for his future, pivotal role as the leader of modern Turkey. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli became a defining national moment, though the campaign had failed. The unparalleled courage and immense sacrifice of the Anzac soldiers became an enduring source of national pride. April 25th, the day of the landing, became Anzac Day, a sacred national day of remembrance. The campaign, for these young nations, marked the beginning of a burgeoning national identity, separate and distinct from the distant British Empire. It was a painful, bloody beginning, but one that mattered deeply. In the broader, terrifying story of the war, Gallipoli stands as a tragic, poignant example of how grand strategy, unchecked ambition, and countless human lives can collide in a cataclysm of futility. It was a desperate, audacious attempt to change the course of a global conflict, but instead of a decisive breakthrough, it delivered only immense loss and unmitigated suffering. It brutally showed that even in new places, with new tactics, and across vastly different terrain, the war still adhered to the same brutal, horrifying rules. Plans could go catastrophically wrong. Soldiers would die in droves, and the front lines would remain stubbornly, agonizingly still. As the Allies licked their profound wounds and regrouped elsewhere, the war relentlessly dragged on. The Western Front remained locked in its slow, soul-destroying grind. The Eastern Front was steadily falling apart. The Middle East would continue to burn with widespread revolt and invasion. And in Gallipoli, the ghosts of 1915 would linger long, long after the guns finally fell silent. As the echoes of artillery fire faded from the rocky, blood-soaked shores of Gallipoli, the brutal, relentless logic of the Great War continued its agonizing spread elsewhere. On land, battles dragged on with soul-crushing intensity across Europe and beyond. Yet another front, less visible but profoundly powerful, was unfurling across the vast, indifferent oceans. The war at sea was not defined by the static misery of trenches or the relentless struggle for territory, but by a desperate, invisible battle for control over trade, vital supplies, and the unseen arteries that kept entire nations alive. It wasn't just the soldiers on the front lines who depended on these crucial sea routes. Entire economies, millions of civilians, and vast armies waited anxiously for the ships that brought essential food, precious fuel, vital weapons, and life-saving medicine. And during World War I, the seas themselves became battlegrounds, every bit as deadly as the ravaged fields of France or the desolate deserts of the Middle East. Chapter 13. The Silent Hunters, Blockades and Submarines at Sea. At the very heart of this naval conflict lay two major, opposing strategies: the suffocating British blockade and Germany's terrifying new weapon, the submarine. Both sides understood with chilling clarity that starving the enemy of essential resources could be just as devastatingly effective as defeating them in direct battle. If you couldn't get bullets to the front lines or bread to your starving populace, you simply couldn't win a war. So, ships, both colossal warships and vulnerable civilian merchant vessels, suddenly became high-stakes targets in a global struggle for survival. Britain, with its legendary and formidable Royal Navy, had long dominated the world's oceans. From the very start of the war, the British meticulously focused on leveraging this immense naval strength to impose a suffocating blockade on Germany. This meant meticulously surrounding German ports, halting any merchant ships attempting to enter or leave, and ruthlessly cutting off access to the raw materials Germany desperately needed: coal, iron ore, nitrates for explosives, rubber. These weren't mere luxuries. They were the very lifelines of a modern industrial war machine. Without them, German factories would fall silent. Soldiers would go hungry, and the entire war effort would, inevitably, crumble from the inside. The blockade was far from just a few ships idly floating near Germany. It was massive in scale and devastatingly far-reaching. British warships relentlessly patrolled the North Sea, meticulously inspecting cargo from neutral countries, and intercepting anything that could potentially support Germany's war machine. It was a slow, methodical, and over time, brutally effective strategy. German imports plummeted dramatically, and civilian shortages began to bite deeply into the population. The economy strained under unbearable pressure. By 1916 and 1917, people in German cities were beginning to suffer from severe hunger, widespread shortages, and endured bitterly cold winters with little fuel. But blockades, by their very nature, cut both ways. Germany simply couldn't match the Royal Navy ship for ship on the surface. Their formidable fleet was modern, yes, but significantly smaller. Instead, they turned to a different kind of weapon, one that didn't rely on massive guns or towering steel hulls. They unleashed their submarines, chillingly called U-boats, short for undersea boat, or undersea boat. These machines were silent, unseen hunters, capable of lurking menacingly below the surface and striking without any warning. And while they were small and, on the surface, vulnerable, they were terrifyingly deadly. In the early months of the war, U-boat attacks were limited and relatively cautious. But as the British blockade tightened its chokehold, Germany grew increasingly desperate to strike back. Submarines began to ruthlessly target merchant ships bringing vital supplies to Britain and France. The objective was chillingly clear: if they could sink enough cargo ships, they could starve the Allies, just as the British were relentlessly trying to starve them. Submarine warfare was utterly terrifying. Merchant ships, often unarmed, rarely stood a chance. A U-boat would surface, fire a torpedo, and then disappear again into the depths, leaving no trace. There was no warning, no precious time to escape. Ships vanished beneath the unforgiving waves in minutes, dragging their valuable cargo and their entire crews down with them. At first, Germany attempted to adhere to certain rules, such as giving crews time to abandon ship. But these fragile rules quickly eroded as the war dragged on and the stakes rose to unimaginable heights. One of the most infamous and shocking moments came in 1915, when a German U-boat brazenly sank the British ocean liner Lusitania. The ship was carrying thousands of civilians, including women and children, as well as, controversially, war supplies. Nearly 1,200 people perished, including 128 Americans. The attack sent shock waves across the world, and U.S. public opinion, previously neutral, began a significant shift. Perhaps people thought this wasn't just Europe's war anymore. Germany argued correctly that the ship had been carrying military cargo. But the sheer loss of civilian lives was a catastrophic public relations disaster. It outraged public opinion, especially in the United States. For a time, Germany, fearing direct American intervention, backed off from its policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. But the pause didn't last. By 1917, Germany was rapidly running out of options. The British blockade was relentlessly strangling their economy, and the brutal war on land was making no progress. In a desperate, high-stakes gamble, they made a risky decision. They resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. This meant ruthlessly sinking any ship, military or civilian, allied or neutral, without warning, if it was headed to or from Britain. They knew this might provoke the United States, but they desperately believed they could sink enough ships, fast enough, to break Britain before America could fully enter the war and make a decisive difference. So, the U-boats launched their most intense, brutal campaign yet. They roamed the vast Atlantic, the English Channel, and the Mediterranean, relentlessly hunting merchant convoys and patrol vessels. In early 1917 alone, hundreds of ships were sunk. The losses were staggering, and vital supplies began running dangerously low in Britain. There were genuine fears of famine, of complete collapse. It seemed, for a terrifying moment, like the German strategy might actually work. But the Allies, with ingenuity and grim determination, adapted. One of the most important changes was the widespread introduction of convoys, groups of merchant ships traveling together, meticulously escorted and protected by military vessels. By traveling in these protected formations, guarded by destroyers and armed ships, the odds of surviving a U-boat attack improved dramatically. Submarines, after all, were fragile. If they were spotted, they could be forced to dive, or even, decisively, destroyed. The convoy system didn't stop all attacks, but it cut losses significantly. Combined with the rapid development of better technology, such as sonar, a nascent form of sound detection, and devastating depth charges, and the increasing use of aircraft patrols, the Allies slowly began to turn the tide. Still, the human cost was enormous. Thousands of sailors, both military and civilian, tragically lost their lives at sea. Crews sailed knowing, with a chilling certainty, that they might never reach land again. Merchant mariners, in their vulnerable vessels, became frontline soldiers in their own right, bravely facing torpedoes and icy waters to keep their beleaguered countries alive. The war at sea was not about grand glory. It was about sheer, desperate endurance. Every ship that arrived safely meant another week of desperately needed food, another load of vital ammunition, another precious breath of hope. And the impact of this unseen naval war went far beyond Europe. This was a truly global war, and the vast, interconnected oceans linked all of it. Ships from India, Canada, Australia, and Africa carried men and materials to the battlefields. Colonial troops arrived by sea, oil from the Middle East, rubber from Southeast Asia, grain from the Americas. All of it flowed through these crucial ocean routes. When ships were sunk, the damage wasn't just to the cargo. It profoundly disrupted entire economies. Insurance prices soared, vital trade routes shifted, and bustling ports slowed down. The war's ripple effects reached everywhere, and the sea was the main, indispensable highway. The German gamble, unleashing unrestricted submarine warfare, ultimately backfired. In April 1917, Just a few months after the policy was resumed, the United States declared war on Germany. The relentless U-boat attacks, combined with other glaring diplomatic missteps, most notably the Zimmermann telegram, a secret message from Germany to Mexico proposing an alliance against the U.S., pushed America irrevocably into the conflict. And with America came fresh troops, immense industrial power, and the potential to decisively break the agonizing stalemate that had defined the war for years. In the end, the war at sea didn't conclude with one massive, decisive naval battle. There was no Trafalgar or Midway. Instead, it was a grinding, invisible struggle that slowly, inexorably wore both sides down. The British blockade had, undeniably, succeeded in choking Germany's economy. German civilians suffered terribly through what became grimly known as the turnip winter, when real food was so scarce that turnips replaced bread and meat in many households. Malnutrition, crippling inflation, and widespread unrest grew throughout Germany. On the Allied side, the convoy system and the surging American support helped ensure that Britain and France did not collapse first. The seas had decided nothing outright, but they had quietly, profoundly shaped the fate of millions. When people envision World War I, they often picture the muddy trenches of the Western Front, the hellish mud of Flanders, the doomed charges at Gallipoli, or the vastness of the Eastern battles. But the war was also fought in silence and salt water, in the cold steel hulls of ships and the terrifying, cold depths where submarines patiently waited. It was a war where shipping lanes mattered as much as front lines, where a single torpedo could have far-reaching political consequences, a war where hunger, isolation, and control of supply were weapons as real and deadly as guns and gas. And as the war dragged on toward its brutal final years, the battle for the seas continued, not always visible, not always remembered, but utterly vital to the ultimate outcome. The oceans had become a vast theater of war, one where the fate of nations hinged precariously on whether ships could keep moving through water darkened by unseen danger. At first, the airplane seemed like just another fascinating invention. A curious novelty, perhaps, but certainly not something that could decisively shape the course of a global conflict. When World War I began, planes were primarily used for one simple, unassuming task: observation. Pilots would fly above the vast, sprawling battlefield, their eyes scanning the landscape below, and then report back what they saw: enemy troop positions, their movements, the critical supply lines. It was a bird's-eye view, a strategic advantage that generals had never possessed before, allowing armies to suddenly see beyond the immediate horizon. But no one in those nascent, early days could have possibly imagined what the skies would soon become: a terrifying, brutal, and intimately personal new battlefield, where men dueled alone in the thin air, high above the clouds, armed with little more than a fragile machine gun, a shaky engine, and nerves of steel. Chapter 14. Knights of the Sky, the Rise of the Fighter Pilot. Initially, these reconnaissance flights were largely unopposed. Pilots from opposing sides often flew relatively safely, occasionally even waving to one another as they passed in the vast, open sky. But this strange, fleeting civility didn't last. The intelligence these planes brought back was simply too valuable. The enemy had to be stopped from gathering it. And just like that, without grand strategy or official pronouncements, the age of the fighter pilot began, not as a meticulously planned military doctrine, but as a desperate, ingenious improvisation. Pilots, eager to gain an advantage, started bringing pistols or rifles with them into the cockpit, trying to take potshots at enemy planes. It was a crude and largely ineffective method. Imagine trying to accurately aim a pistol at another fast-moving plane while flying at high speed in the open air. It was almost impossible. Then came the next step: mounting actual machine guns onto the planes. But even that wasn't as straightforward as it sounds. Early planes were typically biplanes, with two wings stacked one above the other, and their crucial propellers spun directly in front of the pilot. Firing a machine gun straight ahead meant, inevitably, shooting directly through the propeller, not exactly a sound idea for flight. For a while, engineers desperately tried to circumvent this problem by mounting guns on the upper wing, or by having a second person, an observer, man a gun in the rear cockpit. But these solutions still left the pilot with frustratingly limited direct firing control. The true breakthrough came with a deadly, revolutionary innovation called the synchronization gear. This ingenious device allowed a machine gun to fire through the spinning propeller blades without hitting them, by precisely timing the shots to the propeller's rotation. It sounds like madness, a suicidal gamble, but it worked. And it changed everything. Now, for the very first time, a single pilot could both fly the aircraft and fire directly in the same direction. Planes ceased being mere observers and became hunters, and in the vast, open skies over Europe, a terrifying new kind of warrior was born. Dogfighting, fast, deadly aerial combat, became a daily, visceral part of life above the trenches. The planes themselves were small, incredibly light, and unbelievably fragile, constructed mostly of wood and canvas. A single well-placed bullet could rip a wing, or ignite the fuel tank. There were no parachutes. If your plane caught fire or broke apart in the sky, that was, chillingly, the absolute end. Still, despite the terrifying risks, young men lined up eagerly to become fighter pilots. It was dangerous, sure, but it offered a thrilling, romantic escape from the pervasive mud, the ever-present rats, and the soul-crushing misery of the trenches below. In the cramped, solitary cockpit, you weren't just one of many, you were a lone warrior, a knight of the sky. Many of these early pilots were barely out of school, their faces still boyish. They were daring, ambitious, and utterly eager to prove themselves in this thrilling, deadly new arena. The public adored them. Newspapers wrote breathless accounts of their exploits, bestowing upon them dramatic nicknames and transforming them into instant legends. None captured the public imagination more than the German pilot Manfred von Richthofen, better known to the world as the Red Baron, flying his distinctive bright red Fokker triplane. He claimed an astonishing 80 confirmed kills, 80 enemy planes shot down. He was described as calm, precise, and ruthlessly effective. The Allies feared him, and his name became a chilling symbol of air superiority. But he wasn't alone. The British boasted their own aces, like Albert Ball and Edward Manick. The French had René Fonck and Georges Guymer. These men weren't just fighting individual battles. They were, in their deadly dance in the sky, defining an entirely new kind of warfare. In the air, everything was different. Unlike the ground below, there were no trenches, no protective cover, no hiding places. You saw your enemy, and they saw you. You circled, climbed, dived, looped, and spun. Each pilot desperately trying to gain the superior position, to get behind the other and fire the winning shot. These dogfights were incredibly fast and disorienting. Like chaotic dances of death performed high in the clouds. Pilots had to master their fragile machines completely. A small mistake, a slip, a stall, a misjudged turn, any of these meant instant death. It wasn't just about being brave. You had to be incredibly skilled, disciplined, and endlessly aware of your surroundings. Many pilots, tragically, didn't survive long enough to even learn the ropes. Life expectancy at the front for new pilots could be measured in mere weeks. But those who did survive, those who became aces, gained immense prestige. In a war increasingly defined by muddy stalemates, anonymous mass death, and unspeakable suffering, fighter pilots offered a rare, romanticized image of individual valor. They wore silk scarves, painted their planes with distinctive symbols or personal colors, and became almost like celebrities. Some airmen kept poignant diaries or wrote detailed letters home, vividly describing their missions and capturing the strange, lonely terror of flying in combat. They weren't just machines, they were young men facing death in a way that was uniquely, terrifyingly personal. The planes themselves evolved at a blistering pace. At the start of the war, most planes could barely reach 80 miles per hour. By the end, they were significantly faster. sturdier, and much better armed. Engineers on both sides relentlessly pushed aviation forward in a frantic race to outbuild the enemy. New types of engines, stronger airframes, better guns, and improved maneuverability gave pilots greater control and speed. Designs like the British Sopwith Camel or the German Albatros became legendary for their balance of power and agility. Each new model brought with it new tactics, new possibilities, and inevitably, new risks. But the air war wasn't just about thrilling one-on-one dogfights. As time wore on, it became far more organized and systematic. Squadrons were formed, missions were meticulously coordinated, and planes were assigned to specific, specialized tasks. Some were scouts, some were dedicated fighters, and some, perhaps most dangerously, were bombers. These bombers flew over enemy lines, often under the cloak of night, dropping explosives on vital supply depots, bustling train stations, and even, terrifyingly, civilian cities. They were big, slow, and vulnerable, but their psychological impact was immense. For the very first time, the home front was no longer safe. The war had literally come to the skies above people's houses. To protect these vulnerable bombers, fighter planes had to escort them. This necessity led to larger, more chaotic air battles, where dozens of planes might clash at once in a swirling, deafening swarm of engine noise, machine gun fire, and spinning wings. The coordination needed was enormous. Pilots had to work as close-knit teams, communicating with precise signals and maintaining tight formations. The romanticized lone wolf image of the pilot still existed, but increasingly, success in the air depended on cooperation and discipline. Air superiority became a crucial goal in itself. If your side controlled the sky, your ground troops could move more freely. Your bombers could strike with impunity, and your eyes in the air could see without fear of being shot down. And as air power grew, so too did the technology on the ground to combat it. Anti-aircraft guns, grimly nicknamed Archies by British pilots, were set up along the front. These weapons fired exploding shells into the sky, desperately trying to hit or scare away enemy planes. They weren't always accurate, but they made flying infinitely more dangerous. Soon, powerful searchlights, menacing barrage balloons, and even early, rudimentary radar-like systems were being developed. The air war was rapidly becoming its own distinct battlefield, complete with its own unique defenses, complex strategies, and unwritten rules. Still, for all the meticulous tactics and strategic planning, much of air combat ultimately came down to split-second decisions. You might spot an enemy plane 1,000 feet below and dive, hoping to catch them off guard. Or you might find yourself suddenly tailed, with bullets ripping through the air just inches from your wings. Every single flight was a desperate gamble. Every mission could be your last. And the sky offered no mercy. There was no surrender up there, no chance to crawl away or hide. It was just you, your fragile machine, and the endless, unforgiving blue. As the war dragged on, thousands of young men perished in the skies above Europe. But they left behind more than just stories of bravery. They fundamentally shaped the future of warfare. World War I was the first major conflict to extensively use planes in combat, but it would certainly not be the last. The hard one, often brutal. Lessons learned during those years: the critical need for air dominance, the devastating power of coordinated aerial attacks, the overwhelming importance of speed and surprise, would define wars for decades to come. The fighter pilot, once a reckless daredevil clutching a pistol in his hand, had transformed into something entirely new. He was now an integral part of a complex, rapidly growing air force. He was meticulously trained, rigorously tested, and supported by brilliant engineers, strategic planners, and dedicated ground crews. He flew machines that pushed the very limits of what was technologically possible. And yet, in many profound ways, he was still alone. Still climbing into the sky with no guarantee he would ever return. By the end of the war, air combat had changed irrevocably. What had begun as simple reconnaissance had become a deadly, intricate duel in the clouds. Pilots had carved out a completely new space in warfare, fast, mobile, and terrifying. And though the trenches below still held most of the war's unimaginable horrors, the skies had, undeniably, claimed their own grim share of blood and fire. The rise of the fighter pilot was more than a mere technological shift, it was a profound human one. It was about courage, skill, and desperate survival in a space where failure meant plummeting from the sky. It was about young men learning to master machines barely older than themselves, and using them to fight battles that had no map, no trench lines, and no mercy. And it was about how war, once fought only on land and sea, had taken to the air, forever changing the way humanity thought about conflict and the way it would fight. Chapter 15. The Unseen Front, Civilians at War. While fighter pilots battled for supremacy in the skies and soldiers fought and died in the soul-crushing mire of the trenches, another quieter, but no less significant war was unfolding back home. It was less visible, less dramatic, but profoundly important. It was a war fought in kitchens, in bustling factories, and within the close-knit confines of neighborhoods. It was a war of endless patience, of grim sacrifice, of constant waiting and agonizing worry. For millions of ordinary civilians, daily life itself became a battlefield of its own. The home front was no longer a safe, distant haven from the conflict. It had, irrevocably, become an integral part of it. As the war relentlessly dragged on, governments across the belligerent nations realized with chilling clarity that victory could not be achieved by armies alone. It demanded the full, unwavering support of the entire population. Everyone had to contribute, everyone had to endure. Suddenly, every aspect of everyday life was profoundly shaped by the pressing needs of the war. Food, fuel, clothing, and even basic soap became precious, carefully hoarded commodities. Rationing was systematically introduced to ensure that everyone received just enough, and no more. You couldn't simply walk into a store and buy whatever you desired. You had to manage carefully, meticulously. Meat, sugar, butter, and bread were severely limited. People were issued ration books filled with stamps or coupons, strictly controlling how much they could purchase. It wasn't easy. Families had to stretch every meal, making do with less. Housewives, with ingenuity, became experts at doing more with less, cleverly replacing meat with lentils, baking cakes without eggs, and conjuring meals out of mere scraps. Cookbooks were published specifically to help people make the absolute most of their meager rations, offering recipes for war cakes and stews concocted from leftovers. People began cultivating vegetables in their backyards or in public parks. These were aptly named victory gardens. Chickens were kept in small pens behind homes, contributing to the family's food supply. Nothing, absolutely nothing, was wasted. Bones were boiled for soup, leftover fat from cooking was meticulously saved and reused. Even old clothes were patched and repurposed. You simply didn't throw anything away. But rationing wasn't solely about going without. It was also profoundly about fairness. The underlying idea was to ensure that everyone, whether rich or poor, had access to the absolute basics. And for many, that created a strange, unexpected sense of unity. Everyone stood in the same long lines, everyone dealt with the same frustrating shortages, everyone made the same personal sacrifices. It brought people together, even as the war itself tore so many apart. Of course, there was more to life on the home front than just food. With so many men away fighting at the front, someone had to step into their shoes in the workforce. Women, with remarkable determination, stepped forward in huge numbers, joining the labor force like never before. They worked tirelessly in factories, building vital weapons, assembling fragile planes, and packing dangerous shells. They drove ambulances, repaired complex machinery, and ran farms. It was hard, dirty, and often dangerous work. Many women had never held a job outside the home before. But now they were performing tasks that had once been exclusively considered men's work. and they were doing them exceptionally well. The war fundamentally changed the way society perceived women, not just as caretakers and homemakers, but as capable workers, resilient leaders, and decisive decision-makers. This profound shift didn't happen overnight, and there was still significant resistance in many places, but the transformation was undeniably real. It planted the crucial seeds for future changes in women's rights and their roles in society. For many women, the war represented the very first time they earned their own wages. The first time they experienced genuine independence. When the war eventually ended, some were, naturally, expected to return to their traditional roles, but the world had irrevocably changed. And many women were simply not willing to go back. Children, too, were caught in the war in ways they didn't always fully understand. Some lost fathers, brothers, or uncles. Some were evacuated from cities threatened by terrifying air raids. Others were put to work in small ways, helping with victory gardens, collecting scrap metal for the war effort, or running errands. Schools adjusted their lessons to include fervent national pride, jingoistic history, and the importance of service to the country. And everywhere, children were surrounded by constant reminders of war, recruitment posters, soldiers on leave, unsettling blackouts, and whispered stories of battles far away. They grew up fast, they had to. In order to cope with the demands of the time. To keep the home front going, governments needed more than just cooperation, they needed unwavering belief. They needed people to remain hopeful, fiercely loyal, and grimly determined. That's where propaganda came in. Posters, films, stirring speeches, and patriotic songs were systematically used to shape how people thought and felt about the war. Messages were ubiquitous, plastered on the walls of schools, flickering in movie theaters, emblazoned on street corners. Some urged people to save food, buy war bonds, or keep silent about military secrets. Others praised the bravery of soldiers, warned against insidious enemy spies, or encouraged women to take on new, vital roles. The images were powerful, evocative. Posters depicted heroic soldiers charging into battle, smiling nurses caring for the wounded, or proud families waving tearful goodbyes. The enemy was often depicted as monstrous, cruel, or cunning. It was all meticulously designed to stir raw emotion, fear, pride, anger, and desperate hope. It wasn't always subtle, but it worked. It constantly reminded people that their everyday sacrifices had profound meaning, that they were part of something far bigger. That the war wasn't just happening far away, it was happening right here, in their own lives. But not all civilians wholeheartedly supported the war. There were protests too. Some people openly opposed the violence, the compulsory conscription, or the direction their government was taking. Pacifists, those who believed in peace above all else, were often mocked or even arrested. In some countries, strikes broke out when workers demanded better pay or safer working conditions. These moments revealed the deep tensions simmering beneath the surface. Not everyone viewed the war in the same light, not everyone felt heard. And sometimes, fear of dissent led governments to crack down harshly on freedoms, limiting speech and controlling the press. There was also the constant, crushing weight of loss. Letters from the front brought the devastating news of husbands, sons, and fathers who would not be coming home. Black armbands and veils became a common sight. Families grieved in private, even as the public was relentlessly urged to stay strong. The pain wasn't always visible, but it was there, a pervasive, quiet ache around kitchen tables, in silent bedrooms, in the empty chair by the fireplace. Every knock on the door could be the dreaded telegram no one wanted to receive. Every letter might be the last. Even with all the hardship, the home front grimly kept going. People adapted, they found ways to cope. Community halls hosted lively dances and concerts to lift spirits. Children put on plays and sang songs about victory. Local newspapers printed heartwarming stories of small triumphs, babies born, victory gardens harvested, small milestones met. In the midst of fear and crushing fatigue, life carried on. People married, worked, laughed, and cried. They made the best of it, because, simply, they had to. Technology also played a crucial role. Radio became a vital tool, bringing news, music, and stirring speeches directly into homes. It was a powerful way to feel connected, to hear the voice of the Prime Minister, to learn about the latest battle, or to listen to a favorite song. Radios didn't just inform, they comforted. They made the distant war feel closer, but paradoxically, also less lonely. People would gather around the radio in the evenings, sometimes holding hands, listening together in hushed silence. War bonds became another crucial way civilians supported the fight. These were loans people made to the government, with the promise of being paid back later. Buying a bond meant actively investing in the war effort. Schools, churches, and workplaces encouraged everyone to buy them. Even children saved their precious pennies to help. It wasn't just about money, it was about belief. A profound belief that the immense sacrifice would be worth it, that victory would come, that peace was, truly, possible. And then there were the moments of stark fear that brutally reminded civilians they weren't so far from the front after all. In cities and towns near the fighting, or under the terrifying threat of bombing, people practiced blackouts, turning off all lights at night so enemy planes couldn't find them. Windows were covered, street lights dimmed, and cars drove with their headlights shaded. Air raid drills were held, sirens screamed ominously in the night, and families rushed to basements or shelters. The fear was real. Even far from the trenches, people held their breath every time the sky rumbled. All of this changed people. The war shaped not just what they did, but how they fundamentally viewed the world. It made them think differently about sacrifice, duty, and sheer survival. It brought people together in new, unexpected ways, but it also starkly revealed deep inequalities. While some families struggled desperately to feed themselves, others openly profited from lucrative war contracts. While some women gained profound new freedoms, others faced harsh criticism or rigid limits. The war opened doors, but it also left lasting scars. When it finally ended, the world didn't simply snap back to what it had been before. Too much had changed, too many had died, too many had given too much. Rationing didn't disappear overnight. Economic hardship lingered. Families were left to pick up the shattered pieces of lives broken by loss. But there was pride too. Ordinary people had faced extraordinary challenges, and they had endured. Life on the home front wasn't just about waiting, it was about doing. It was about filling the gaping holes left by war, about making do. About standing firm even when the ground literally shook beneath them. It was about millions of unnamed, unseen acts of quiet courage. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but without it, the war simply could not have been fought, let alone won. And as the soldiers slowly returned, some wounded in body, some in spirit, the people who had stayed behind greeted them not as mere bystanders, but as fellow warriors. Different battles, yes, but integral parts of the same war. A war that had reached into every kitchen, every workshop, every school, and every single heart. The home front may not have fired bullets or piloted planes, but it carried the war on its shoulders. And when the guns finally fell silent, it was the quiet, resilient strength of ordinary people that helped hold the world together. The war had been raging for years. Cities were bombed. Soldiers were buried in foreign soil, and countless families grieved. Europe, a continent once vibrant and confident, was utterly exhausted. But far across the vast Atlantic, another nation had been watching, listening, and patiently waiting: the United States. Powerful yet distant, America had, at first, steadfastly stayed out of the bloody fighting. America believed this was fundamentally Europe's war, not theirs, a brutal conflict fought far away between old empires, tangled alliances, and ancient rivalries. But by 1917, that perceived distance no longer felt so far anymore, and soon, the war would cease to be merely Europe's problem. It would irrevocably become America's too. Chapter 16. The sleeping giant stirs. the United States enters the war. In the early years of the conflict, the United States made a concerted effort to maintain its neutrality. President Woodrow Wilson, a man deeply committed to peace, harbored the hope that America could serve as the voice of reason, a calming influence while Europe burned. American ships continued to cross the Atlantic, dutifully bringing goods to countries on both sides of the warring factions. American factories, bustling with production, still manufactured products that found their way into the war zones. But crucially, America did not send soldiers. It did not, at least officially, take sides. Yet, neutrality, as it swiftly turned out, proved far harder to maintain than it appeared. The world was changing at a terrifying pace. Beneath the ocean's surface, German submarines, the dreaded U-boats, began launching ruthless attacks on ships without warning. Their chilling goal was to cut off vital supplies to Britain and other allied nations. They often did not bother to check who was on board passenger ships. Merchant vessels, if it sailed near enemy waters, it was ruthlessly considered fair game and at grave risk. In 1915, a British ship named the Lusitania was tragically torpedoed, resulting in the loss of nearly 1,200 lives, including 128 Americans. The news sent a profound shockwave across the United States, and American public opinion, previously detached, began to undeniably shift. Perhaps, people began to think, this wasn't just Europe's war anymore. Perhaps America wasn't as far removed as it had desperately hoped. Germany, facing international outrage, promised to cease targeting civilian ships, but the damage to its reputation was already done, and tensions continued to mount. Then, in early 1917, Germany made a bold and incredibly dangerous decision. It resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, authorizing attacks on any ship that entered Allied waters. It was a desperate gamble, intended to strangle Britain before the U.S. could fully react, but it also proved to be the decisive spark that lit the fuse. At the very same time, another shocking event pushed the U.S. inexorably closer to war. A secret message, infamously known as the Zimmermann telegram, was intercepted by British intelligence. This telegram, sent from Germany to Mexico, contained a chilling proposal. Germany promised to help Mexico regain lost territories, Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, if Mexico joined the war against the U.S. When this message was made public, Americans were absolutely furious. It felt like a direct, undeniable threat, a profound betrayal. A stark sign that staying out of the war might no longer be a viable option. By April 1917, President Wilson, with a heavy heart, stood before Congress. He declared that the world must be made safe for democracy, and that America could no longer remain silent while chaos and tyranny spread. On April 6, 1917, the United States formally declared war on Germany. The country that had once stood on the sidelines was now stepping directly into the roaring inferno. At first, the American military was woefully unprepared. The army was small, equipped with outdated gear, and possessed limited training. But that swiftly changed. Factories across the nation were converted into massive war production machines. Men eagerly lined up to enlist. Patriotic posters adorned walls, calling citizens to duty. The Selective Service Act introduced a nationwide draft, and young men across the country received notices, grimly telling them to report for service. They came from farms, bustling cities, roaring factories, and quiet schools. They were teachers, clerks, sons, fathers, and brothers. They trained hard, with grim determination, and prepared to cross the vast ocean. This burgeoning new force became known as the American Expeditionary Forces, AF, and under the resolute leadership of General John J. Pershing. They began arriving in Europe in large numbers by 1918, fresh, full of boundless energy, and utterly ready to fight. The arrival of the Americans instilled a powerful sense of hope in the weary Allies. It wasn't just about the sheer numbers of fresh troops, it was profoundly about morale. Europe had been bleeding for years, The brutal, soul-crushing reality of trench warfare had drained the spirit of countless soldiers. Supplies were perilously low, casualties were impossibly high, and people were simply exhausted. But then the Americans showed up, and everything began to feel different, a resurgence of possibility. At home, life in the United States changed almost overnight. The country rapidly became a war economy. Factories, once producing consumer goods, churned out guns, ammunition, tanks, and uniforms. Women, with remarkable determination, took on jobs once exclusively held by men. Children collected scrap metal for the war effort. Citizens were urged to grow food, conserve precious fuel, and support the troops however they possibly could. War bonds were aggressively sold everywhere, encouraging financial contribution. The media, with relentless focus, promoted unity and sacrifice. Propaganda posters urged people to enlist, save resources, or be vigilant for spies. Songs, films, and stirring speeches tirelessly kept the public motivated. Everyone was told they had a crucial role in the war, even if they never held a rifle. And just like in Europe, the U.S. government began to exert greater control over daily life. It set prices, managed vital supplies, and employed censorship to limit what could be printed or said. The underlying idea was simple and stark: win the war, no matter what it took, even if it meant temporarily limiting certain freedoms at home. As American soldiers began fighting on the front lines, the tide of the war slowly, inexorably, started to turn. They participated in crucial battles like Belleau Wood and the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Their impact was immediate and profound. They brought desperately needed strength where others had been stretched too thin. They fought bravely, with fresh vigor, and they carried with them a palpable sense that the brutal end might finally be near. But the war was still horrifically brutal. American soldiers experienced the same unspeakable horrors their European allies had endured for years. They faced the relentless chatter of machine guns, the insidious agony of poison gas, and the terrifying roar of incoming artillery. The ubiquitous mud, the swarms of rats, the crippling shell shock, it was all too real. Thousands of Americans died far from home. But they kept pushing forward, and their surging momentum helped to force the Germans back. Germany, utterly exhausted and increasingly isolated, began to visibly crumble. Its allies were falling apart, its people were starving, and widespread protests were erupting across the homeland. With the full weight of American power now unequivocally behind the Allies, surrender became unavoidable. On November 11, 1918, the war, at long last, ended. The guns went silent. The world, with a collective, profound sigh, exhaled. The American role, though late, had been decisive. Its entry changed everything. It decisively tilted the balance of power, giving the Allies the crucial edge they desperately needed. It shortened the war, saving countless lives. And it introduced the United States as a new, formidable global power. But victory, as always, came at a steep cost. Over 100,000 American lives were tragically lost, many more returned home wounded, physically and emotionally, or forever changed by the horrors they had witnessed. Families grieved, communities felt the profound loss, and the nation had to grapple with a critical question. What kind of role did it wish to play in the world going forward? President Wilson harbored ambitious ideas. He deeply believed that America's involvement in the war should lead to something far better, something transformative. He passionately advocated for the creation of a League of Nations, a groundbreaking international organization, a group of countries that would work together to peacefully prevent future wars. He hoped that this global cooperation could replace destructive conflict with constructive dialogue, that peace could be protected by unity, not merely by weapons. But not everyone in America agreed. Back in the U.S., many people were simply tired of foreign entanglements. They didn't want more involvement with Europe's complex, endless problems. They desperately wanted to come home, rebuild, and return to a semblance of normal life. The Senate, reflecting this isolationist sentiment, rejected the League of Nations. America, after dramatically changing the course of the war, ultimately chose not to fully participate in the ambitious peace effort Wilson had so passionately dreamed of. The war was over, but the profound questions it raised weren't so easily answered. Still, the impact was clear. The United States had stepped onto the world stage, irrevocably changed. Its economy had swelled, its influence had expanded dramatically, and its people had proven they could fight, sacrifice, and lead. And even though they withdrew from international politics for a time, the world had taken notice. A new chapter had begun. Not just for America, but for the global balance of power. And yet, for all the pride and victory, the war had left behind deep, indelible scars, both in Europe and in the US. People struggled to make sense of what they had endured, why so many had died, what had truly been gained, and whether such a catastrophe could ever happen again. In the years that followed, the answers would be fiercely debated, monuments would be built, and soldiers would try, often fruitlessly, to adjust to life after the trenches. Families would carry memories that never faded. But for America, World War I marked a definitive turning point. It was no longer just a rising nation, it was now a global force. And its decision to enter the war had changed not only the outcome of the conflict, but the very future of the century that followed. The world was different now, and so, fundamentally, was America. Chapter 17: The Empire Cracks, Russia's Revolution and the Eastern Front's Collapse. While the United States was, with surging energy and strength, entering the Great War on one side of the world, Russia, on the other, was actively falling apart. Its sprawling armies were collapsing, its vast populace was starving, and its government was fundamentally breaking down. The brutal, relentless demands of the war had pushed Russia far beyond its limits, and soon, everything within the country would, inexorably, explode. The Eastern Front would not be lost in a grand battle. It would, chillingly, crumble from within. When World War I began, Russia was, on paper, one of the largest and most formidable empires in the world. It commanded millions of soldiers and possessed an immense amount of land, stretching across 2 continents. But beneath all that impressive size and raw power, Russia was, fundamentally, weak. Its economy was fragile, teetering on the brink, its people were overwhelmingly poor and oppressed, its government was outdated, clinging to archaic traditions, and its ruler, Tsar Nicholas II, seemed tragically out of touch with the profound suffering of ordinary people. While the other great powers of Europe had begun to modernize their industries and societies, Russia remained stubbornly stuck in the past. When war broke out in 1914, Russia swiftly joined the Allies to fight against Germany and Austria-Hungary. At first, there was a brief surge of fervent patriotism. People initially supported the war, believing it was their sacred duty to defend the motherland. But that initial spirit of unity and sacrifice did not, tragically, last long. The Russian army was poorly trained and even more poorly equipped. Soldiers were sent to the front lines without enough rifles, without sufficient bullets, or even proper uniforms. Many, heartbreakingly, were told to wait until someone else died so they could pick up their fallen comrade's weapon. Battles on the Eastern Front were unbelievably brutal. Russia lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers in just the first few months. The army, despite its vast numbers, simply couldn't keep up with Germany's more modern, efficient forces. Vital supplies were incredibly difficult to deliver across Russia's immense territory, and communication was agonizingly slow. Commanders often had no idea what was truly happening on the sprawling battlefield. And as the bodies piled up, morale plummeted. Soldiers began to deeply question what they were fighting for. Back home, things were even worse. The war placed an incredible, unbearable pressure on the already fragile Russian economy. Prices soared. Food became desperately scarce in major cities like Petrograd and Moscow. People waited in impossibly long lines for meager bread rations that often ran out before they reached the front of the queue. Factories struggled to keep up with the overwhelming war demands. The transportation system was a chaotic mess. Coal was in severe shortage. Workers went on strike. Farmers had no incentive to grow food they couldn't sell. The entire system, from top to bottom, was breaking down. Meanwhile, Tsar Nicholas desperately tried to hold everything together. But instead of solving the mounting problems, he only made them worse. In 1915, he made the disastrous decision to take personal command of the army. Despite possessing virtually no military experience, this meant that every single defeat on the battlefield was now blamed directly on him, further eroding public trust. While he was away with the army, his unpopular wife, Alexandra, took over political duties in the capital. But she was deeply disliked by the populace. Many believed she was far too close to a mysterious, enigmatic monk named Rasputin, who seemed to exert a strange, insidious influence over her and, by extension, the government. Rumors of corruption, scandals, and deeply flawed decisions spread like wildfire, causing people to lose all remaining faith in the royal family. By 1917, the situation had become utterly unbearable. Workers and soldiers in Petrograd, driven by desperation, poured into the streets. They vehemently demanded food, peace, and better treatment. At first, the protests were relatively small, but they swelled rapidly. Strikes escalated into angry marches, and those marches quickly spiraled into full-blown riots. Soon, the city was completely out of control. The army was ordered to crush the rebellion, but many soldiers flatly refused. Some, in a revolutionary act, joined the protesters, while others simply walked away, abandoning their posts. The Tsar's power, once absolute, melted overnight. In March 1917, Tsar Nicholas was finally forced to abdicate, to give up the throne. After more than 300 years of Romanov rule, the Russian Empire was, definitively, finished. A new government was hastily formed, known as the Provisional Government. It was comprised of politicians and reformers who optimistically promised change. They declared there would be elections. They vowed to create a true democracy, and most importantly, they pledged to continue the war effort. But that promise to continue the war was a fatal flaw. The people, utterly exhausted and demoralized, did not want to continue the war. They were tired of the relentless fighting, the gnawing hunger, the constant death. The provisional government, tragically, didn't end the chaos. It only added further confusion and instability. While it desperately tried to cling to power, a powerful new group emerged, gaining strength: the Soviets, councils made up of angry, disillusioned workers and soldiers. They represented the raw, defiant voice of the streets, and one of the loudest, most compelling voices within the Soviets belonged to a man named Vladimir Lenin. Lenin had been living in exile for years, meticulously hiding from the Tsar's secret police. But now, with the monarchy gone, he audaciously returned to Russia with a bold, revolutionary message. He declared that the war was a catastrophic disaster. He branded the provisional government weak and corrupt. He promised the people what they desperately craved: peace, land, and bread. And he fervently believed that the workers and peasants, not the politicians, should control the country. Lenin was the charismatic leader of the Bolsheviks, a radical political group that fiercely believed in total, immediate revolution. At first, their numbers were small, but as the provisional government stumbled, the Bolsheviks rapidly gained overwhelming support. People were desperate. They wanted someone, anyone, who could end the unimaginable suffering, and Lenin promised to do just that. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks made their decisive, swift move. They launched a nearly bloodless coup in Petrograd. They stormed government buildings, arrested key leaders, and declared a new government, one, they claimed, run by the people for the people. In reality, it would be ruthlessly controlled by the Bolsheviks themselves, and very soon, Lenin would become the most powerful, autocratic man in all of Russia. One of Lenin's very first acts as the new leader was to pull Russia entirely out of the war. He firmly believed the country simply could not survive if the brutal fighting continued. He immediately sent negotiators to Germany to hammer out a peace deal. It was not easy. Germany, in a position of overwhelming strength, demanded huge, humiliating concessions. The Russians, utterly defeated and desperate, had no choice but to agree. In March 1918, they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Russia was forced to give up massive amounts of land: Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, and significant parts of Poland. It was a devastatingly high price. But the war, at long last, was finally over for Russia. The collapse of the Eastern Front irrevocably changed everything. Germany could now shift its vast number of troops from the east to the Western Front. This gave them a temporary, crucial advantage. For a fleeting moment, it looked as though they might just turn the tide against France and Britain before the Americans could arrive in full force. But it didn't last. The new strength on the Western Front wasn't enough to win the war, and Germany itself was facing its own mounting internal problems, much like Russia had. Meanwhile, Russia descended into profound chaos. The Bolshevik Revolution, far from bringing peace, ignited a brutal civil war. Forces loyal to the old regime, known as the Whites, fiercely fought the Bolsheviks, known as the Reds. Foreign powers, including Britain, France, and the US, even sent troops to support the Whites, desperately hoping to stop the terrifying spread of communism. The fighting tore the country apart. Villages were destroyed, millions died, and hunger and disease spread like wildfire. But eventually, the Bolsheviks, with their ruthless determination, won. By the early 1920s, Lenin and his devoted followers controlled most of the former Russian Empire. They audaciously renamed it the Soviet Union. A new kind of state had been born, a communist one. It was, theoretically, based on ideas of equality and workers' power, but in practice, it swiftly became a one-party system where dissent was brutally crushed and freedom was severely limited. The Russian Revolution didn't just change Russia, it changed the entire world. It inspired revolutionaries everywhere, terrifying governments across Europe, and marked the chilling beginning of a long, uneasy, and deeply suspicious relationship between the capitalist West and the communist East. That profound tension would shape much of the 20th century. But during World War I, the revolution's most immediate and profound effect was the collapse of the Eastern Front. With Russia out of the war, the map of Europe began to visibly shift. The Allies lost a key partner but, in a strange way, also no longer had to support a failing, unstable empire. The vacuum left by Russia was swiftly, powerfully filled by the United States and its burgeoning influence. In the end, the fall of Russia did not save Germany. It did not change the ultimate outcome of the war. But it powerfully demonstrated the destructive power of internal collapse. A war that had started between nations had now broken nations apart from the inside. Armies didn't just fight in trenches anymore, they fought against the very governments that sent them there. From the snowy, desolate fields of Russia to the muddy, suffocating trenches of France. The world was changing faster than anyone had imagined. Empires were falling, new ideologies were rising, and the old order of kings and emperors was coming to a definitive end. The war wasn't just about borders, it was about what kind of world would emerge in its wake. And that world was still, uncertainly, taking shape. Chapter 18. The Inferno of Fortitude, the Longest Battle. As the war relentlessly dragged on, battles became more than mere military operations. They transformed into profound symbols of national pride, of unimaginable suffering, and of a nation's unyielding will to survive. And no single battle encapsulated that grim reality more vividly than Verdun. Verdun wasn't just a place on a map. It became a name that echoed through history, representing both the extraordinary resilience of a nation and the terrifying, relentless cost of modern, industrialized warfare. It was long. It was brutally unforgiving, and for countless soldiers, it felt utterly endless. The year was 1916. By now, the war had settled into a deadly, agonizing stalemate. The Western Front stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border, locked in an intricate, horrifying grid of trenches, barbed wire, and pervasive mud. Neither side could gain significant ground without paying for it in unimaginable blood, and both the Allies and the Central Powers were desperately searching for a decisive breakthrough. Germany had a chilling plan. Their Chief of General Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, held the grim belief that instead of attempting a traditional breakthrough, they could systematically wear France down, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. He chillingly theorized that if they could strike a blow so deep, so painful, and so symbolically devastating, France would bleed itself dry, desperately trying to defend it. And so, he chose Verdun. Verdun was a historic fortress town in northeastern France, situated strategically on the Meuse River. It was surrounded by a formidable ring of ancient forts, some dating back to the 19th century. Strategically, it didn't offer a colossal military advantage, but symbolically it meant everything. It had been the site of past French resistance, a sacred point of national pride. Falkenhayn, with ruthless cunning, believed the French would never, under any circumstances, allow it to fall, and he planned to exploit that very devotion against them. In February 1916, the German army unleashed a massive, overwhelming assault on Verdun. It commenced with an artillery bombardment of unprecedented scale, a cataclysmic roar that shook the very earth. Over 1 million shells were fired in just the opening phase of the attack. Entire sections of ancient forest were flattened, reduced to splinters. Villages disappeared beneath clouds of acrid smoke and raging fire. The noise was constant, deafening, a ceaseless roar. Soldiers described it as a living nightmare, with the sky literally raining down metal for days on end. After the devastating bombardment came the infantry assault. German troops surged forward, capturing outlying villages and forts with brutal efficiency. The French scrambled desperately to respond. At first, they were utterly overwhelmed. Verdun wasn't heavily defended at the time, as France had shifted troops elsewhere, mistakenly believing it was a quiet sector. But now it was under full, relentless attack, and they had to react with lightning speed. General Philippe Pétain was swiftly put in charge of the defense. He was a man of calm, methodical resolve, and deeply aware of the profound importance of holding Verdun. Not just for military reasons, but for what it represented to the entire nation. Pétain famously declared, "They shall not pass." That defiant slogan instantly became the rallying cry for the entire French nation, echoing through the trenches and across the home front. What followed was not a quick battle. It mutated into a grinding, horrifying war of attrition. For 10 agonizing months, from February to December, the two sides fought relentlessly over the same shattered hills, the same pulverized forts, and the same ruined stretches of ground. The front line barely moved. Gains were measured in mere meters. Thousands upon thousands of men died for places with names like Fort Douaumont, Mordum, Dead Man's Hill, and Côte 304. These were not grand cities or rich, strategic lands. They were bits of churned dirt, soaked perpetually in blood, fought over again and again and again. Conditions were horrific beyond description. Shells had transformed the landscape into a desolate wasteland of mud and gaping craters. Trees were shattered stumps, trenches perpetually flooded. The air was thick with acrid smoke, insidious gas, and the pervasive, sickening stench of death. Soldiers lived in a perpetual state of fear, crippling exhaustion, and gnawing hunger. They universally described Verdun as hell. Some were rotated out after a few agonizing weeks, others remained longer, but no one, absolutely no one, left Verdun untouched. One of the key, crucial features of the French defense was what became known as the Sacred Way, La Voie Sacrée. It was a single, vital road leading into Verdun from the south, and it became the literal lifeline of the battle. Day and night, trucks relentlessly rolled along it, bringing in desperately needed supplies, ammunition, and fresh troops. Without that road, Verdun would have inevitably fallen. Over 4,000 vehicles a day used it at the peak of the battle. Men marched in, their faces grim, while others, wounded or dead, were constantly carried out. It was ceaseless motion, ceaseless effort, and ceaseless sacrifice. Pétain meticulously managed the rotation system, ensuring that no units remained too long at the front. This careful system provided soldiers with some desperate hope. They knew they wouldn't be simply left to die, forgotten, in the trenches. It also kept morale just high enough to somehow hold the line. Reinforcements kept coming, so did artillery, and so did the unyielding will to resist. Verdun, remarkably, did not fall. Germany made some initial, rapid gains. They captured Fort Douaumont, one of the largest and most important defenses, early in the battle. But holding it proved incredibly difficult. French counterattacks were fierce and relentless. The Germans advanced slowly, painfully, losing men with every agonizing step. As the months dragged on, their original, ruthless plan to bleed France dry began to, ironically, backfire. They were losing just as many men as the French, perhaps even more. By summer, the British, in a desperate attempt to relieve pressure on Verdun, launched a massive Battle of the Somme. That forced the Germans to shift crucial resources westward. The French, now reinforced and rearmed, began pushing back under the leadership of General Robert Nivelle. They retook many lost positions. By December 1916, the battle was effectively over. The lines had barely moved. But the human cost had been staggering. Verdun had become the longest single battle of the First World War. It lasted 302 days. Nearly 700,000 men were killed, wounded, or went missing. The French lost around 360,000 soldiers. The Germans lost over 330,000. And all of it for a pitiful few kilometers of churned, devastated ground. But despite the sheer horror, Verdun became a powerful symbol of French strength and fortitude. They had not let it fall. They had stood firm, even when it seemed utterly impossible. "They shall not pass" had become a brutal, bloody reality. The psychological impact was just as powerful. Verdun became a deep, agonizing scar on the French memory, but also, paradoxically, a profound source of national pride. It proved that the nation, despite everything, would not give in. But it also starkly showed how modern war had fundamentally changed. Battles weren't quick, victories weren't clean. And progress was measured in bodies, not in borders. After Verdun, Pétain became a national hero. His calm leadership, meticulous attention to logistics, and profound care for the common soldier earned him widespread respect and admiration. But the victory, as always, came at a high cost. Many survivors of Verdun suffered mentally for the rest of their lives. They had witnessed the very worst of what humans could endure, and what they could brutally do to each other. The land around Verdun remained utterly devastated for years. To this day, parts of it are still unsafe. Unexploded shells remain buried in the soil. And villages that were destroyed were never rebuilt. The Zone Rouge, or Red Zone, was officially declared uninhabitable. Nature eventually reclaimed much of the battlefield. But the haunting memory never faded. Verdun taught both sides a grim, undeniable lesson. The old, romanticized ideas of glory and swift victories were dead, crushed beneath the weight of modern artillery and machine guns. War had become industrialized. Men were ground down by machines, not just by bullets, but by crippling exhaustion, pervasive fear, and endless, soul-destroying repetition. It wasn't about courage alone anymore. It was about massive supply lines, overwhelming artillery, and sheer, grinding endurance. The battle also fundamentally shifted how armies thought about defense. Forts, once considered obsolete, played a crucial, unexpected role. And the ability to quickly resupply and systematically rotate troops became central to all military planning. It wasn't just the inherent strength of a defensive position. It was the entire complex system behind it that kept it alive. But above all, Verdun became the symbol for France. It was undeniable proof of national spirit. For Germany, it was a colossal missed opportunity that tragically drained vital resources and crushed morale. For the world, it stood as a chilling warning of what modern war could become: unrelenting, inhuman, and utterly devastating. And yet, even as Verdun slowly ended, the war raged on. The Somme continued, other fronts burned, new, horrific weapons were being developed, and new nations were entering the war. Verdun had not brought peace. It had not broken France. It had not given Germany the decisive edge it so desperately wanted. Instead, it simply showed that the war had entered a grim new phase, one of endurance, total national effort, and unimaginable cost. In the coming years, other battles would be fought, other cities bombarded, and other soldiers sent into the mud. But none would carry quite the same profound weight. Verdun stood alone, a monument not to conquest, but to unimaginable suffering. It was a place where victory looked like mere survival, where holding the line meant sacrificing absolutely everything, where the ultimate question wasn't who won, but who endured. And France, with grim, bloody resolve, had endured. Chapter 19: The Harvest of Sorrows, Blood and Sacrifice at the Somme. After the long, grueling, and utterly horrific Battle of Verdun, where France had, against all odds, stood its ground and defiantly refused to fall, attention grimly shifted to the British. The French had been bleeding themselves white for months on end, and they desperately needed relief, a diversion of German forces from their shattered lines. The idea was simple: launch another major offensive elsewhere on the Western Front, drawing German forces away from the inferno of Verdun. That desperate offensive became the Battle of the Somme. No one knew at the time that it would become one of the bloodiest and most tragically futile battles in human history. The Somme was initially intended to be a joint British and French operation, meticulously planned for the summer of 1916. But as the Germans pressed harder and harder at Verdun, the French, stretched to their breaking point, had to drastically scale back their participation. That left the British to take the overwhelming lead, a new and unfamiliar, indeed daunting, role for them. Until then, the British Army had played a comparatively smaller, supporting part on the Western Front, but now they were preparing to carry the full, immense weight of a full-scale, major offensive. The Somme River flows gently through northern France, and the area around it was mostly quiet, picturesque farmland before the war. That tranquil landscape was about to be irrevocably transformed as vast British forces gathered and prepared to strike. Months of meticulous planning went into the offensive. Commanders, clinging to outdated notions of warfare, genuinely believed that with enough artillery, they could utterly smash through the German lines and finally, decisively, break the agonizing stalemate. They planned one of the largest bombardments the world had ever seen. Over 1.5 million shells were fired in the week leading up to the attack. The stated goal was to utterly destroy German trenches, precisely cut through the formidable barbed wire, and clear an unobstructed path for the infantry. British soldiers were explicitly told that the bombardment would leave nothing alive in the German defenses. They were promised that when the order came to go over the top and charge across no man's land, resistance would be light, almost non-existent. Many, with naive hope, believed it. They trusted their commanders. They trusted the meticulously crafted plan. And for many it was their very first terrifying experience of real combat. Young men, some barely out of school, had trained for months, filled with idealism. Now they were ready to take part in what they were told would be a breakthrough victory. But reality, with brutal swiftness, was far, far different. On July 1, 1916, as dawn broke, thousands upon thousands of British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and began to walk toward the German lines, in neat, disciplined formations. The plan was to advance slowly and deliberately. But the week-long bombardment, despite its unimaginable scale, hadn't achieved what it was supposed to. Many of the German bunkers were dug deep underground, well constructed, and had miraculously survived the shelling. The barbed wire, far from being completely cut, was still largely intact, a deadly, impenetrable barrier. And the Germans, instead of being dead or fleeing in terror, were waiting, grimly, with their deadly machine guns, ready for the slaughter. What happened next was an unspeakable massacre. Within hours, thousands of British troops lay dead or horribly wounded in the churned mud of no man's land. Some units were almost completely wiped out. The first day of the Somme became, irrevocably, the bloodiest day in British military history. Over 57,000 casualties were sustained, including nearly 20,000 dead. Entire communities back home would later discover, with soul-crushing grief, that almost all of their young men were gone. In some towns, nearly every single household lost someone. And yet, the battle, with its horrifying momentum, did not stop. It continued for months, day after agonizing day, week after brutal week. Men fought over the same shattered fields, the same ruined hills, and the same small, devastated villages that would become names etched forever in memory: Thiepval, Mammoth's Wood, Delville Wood, High Wood, and countless others. Each desperate attack gained a little ground, often just a few pitiful 100 yards, but the cost, always, was unimaginably high. Mud, gaping shell craters, and tangled barbed wire made every advance a nightmarish, impossible task. And the German defenses were stubborn, meticulously organized, and chillingly deadly. New experimental weapons were even tested. The British, in a desperate attempt to break the deadlock, used tanks for the very first time in history during the Somme. They were slow, often unreliable, and frequently broke down in the thick mud, but they showed that the future of warfare was fundamentally changing. Still, they did not decisively turn the tide of the battle. The real, devastating damage continued to come from relentless artillery, unforgiving machine guns, and sheer, grinding exhaustion. For the soldiers, life at the Somme was a living hell. The trenches were perpetually filled with icy water and swarms of disease-carrying rats. The wounded lay agonizingly in open ground, unable to move, sometimes for days. Medical services were completely overwhelmed. The dead piled up in grotesque mounds in no man's land, and the sickening stench of decay was constant, pervasive. Letters home, written with grim determination, tried desperately to remain cheerful, but the brutal truth was becoming harder to write, to conceal. Many soldiers felt they were trapped in an unending nightmare with no discernible end. Commanders, clinging to their flawed strategies, kept pushing. They genuinely believed that if they just kept the pressure on, relentlessly, the Germans would eventually crack. And to some extent, the Germans were suffering too. Their losses were enormous, and their lines were stretched perilously thin. But they held on, fighting just as desperately and stubbornly as the Allies. By the time the battle finally, mercifully, ended in November 1916, the front lines had moved only a few miles. The Allies had advanced, yes, but not by much, considering the immense sacrifice. The human cost had been staggering. More than 1 million men were killed, wounded, or went missing on both sides. The British alone suffered over 400,000 casualties. The French had over 200,000. The Germans sustained similar, horrific losses. All for a patch of ground that in peacetime would take only minutes to cross. So why did the battle drag on for so long? Why didn't anyone, call it off when it became agonizingly clear how brutal and futile it was? The answer lies in how people fundamentally understood war at the time. Commanders believed that pressure had to be maintained, no matter the human cost. If they stopped, the enemy would recover. If they retreated, morale would completely collapse. They held the grim, unyielding belief that the only way forward was through the blood, through the mud, through the unimaginable sacrifice. The Somme wasn't just a military event. It profoundly shaped how people back home, far from the trenches, viewed the war. News of the first day's catastrophic losses shocked the British public, but even then, the full, horrifying scale wasn't immediately reported. Over time, families began receiving the dreaded telegrams, one by one, chillingly informing them that their sons, brothers, or husbands were gone. The grief was national, pervasive, but instead of turning people against the war, it often, paradoxically, deepened their grim commitment. The soldiers had died for something, people told themselves. The immense sacrifice had to mean something. So, the war continued its relentless march. At the same time, the Somme irrevocably changed how war was perceived and remembered. The haunting image of brave men charging into battle, only to be mercilessly cut down by relentless machine gun fire, became seared into the memory of an entire generation. Writers, poets, and artists, many of them veterans themselves, began to describe the war not in heroic, romanticized terms, but in words filled with profound loss, unspeakable horror, and quiet despair. The Somme became a chilling symbol, not just of sacrifice, but of the ultimate futility of modern, industrialized warfare. Still, hard-won, bloody lessons were eventually learned. Military leaders slowly began to realize that old, outdated tactics simply did not work against modern defenses. They started developing new approaches, smaller, more flexible units, better coordination between artillery and infantry, and a greater emphasis on meticulous planning and timing. These lessons would slowly, painfully, shape future battles. But they had come at an unimaginably terrible price. The soldiers who fought at the Somme weren't just faceless numbers. They were real people, with dreams, with families, with futures. Many had eagerly volunteered in 1914, full of naive idealism, genuinely believing they were fighting for justice, for freedom, for their beloved country. The Somme brutally changed that. It turned fresh-faced young men into battle-hardened veterans, and often, into permanent victims. Those who miraculously survived carried the indelible memories with them for the rest of their lives. Some spoke of it, others, haunted, simply couldn't. And yet, through all the horror, there was immense courage. There was unwavering loyalty. There was sheer, unyielding determination. In the face of unthinkable suffering, men helped each other, comforted each other, and stood by each other, forging bonds stronger than steel. There were fleeting moments of unexpected kindness, even in the pervasive mud. Letters to home often spoke about missing family, longing desperately for peace, and finding profound strength in the camaraderie of friendship. That, too, was an undeniable part of the Somme. When the battle finally ended, winter was closing in. The ground froze hard. The guns, temporarily, fell silent. The war was far from over. New offensives were already being meticulously planned. But the Somme left a deep, indelible mark. It fundamentally changed how Britain and France saw the war. It changed how soldiers saw themselves. It changed everything. In the years that followed, countless memorials were built, and cemeteries filled with endless rows of pristine white crosses. The names of the missing were carved into cold stone, because their bodies were never found, swallowed by the earth. Families visited the fields where their sons had died. Some never stopping their grieving, some desperately trying to forget, but no one, truly, ever could. The Somme became a brutal lesson, written in blood. It showed that modern war could no longer be about quick, glorious victories or audacious charges. It was about grim endurance, meticulous coordination, and the sheer, unyielding will to keep going. It was about how much suffering a nation could endure, and it forced both military and political leaders to fundamentally rethink how they fought, and, more profoundly, what they were truly fighting for. Even today, the name, Somme, carries an immense, heavy weight. It is spoken with profound respect, deep sorrow, and a sense of almost reverent awe, not because of what was gained, but because of what was tragically, irrevocably lost. It reminds us of the horrifying cost of war, the immense value of every human life, and the enduring importance of remembering those who gave absolutely everything, even when victory seemed impossibly far away. And as the war relentlessly rolled on, with new fronts opening and new challenges ahead, the haunting memory of the Somme stayed with every single soldier who passed through the trenches. It reminded them of what they had already faced, and what still, terrifyingly, might come.